Chapter 19 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The Berries of Merciful Death. Late into that night, Master Nathaniel paced the floor of his pipe room, trying to pierce through the intervening medium of the dry words of the law and the vivider, though less reliable one, of Mistress Ivy's memory, and reach that old rustic tragedy, as it had been before the vultures of time had left nothing of it but dry bones. He felt convinced that Mistress Ivy's reconstruction was correct as far as it went. The farmer had been poisoned, though not by osiers, but by what? And what had been the part played by Pugwalker, alias Endymion Lear? It was, of course, gratifying to his vanity that his instinctive identification of the two had been correct. But how tantalizing it would be if this dead man's tale was to remain but a vague whisper, too low to be heard by the ear of the law. On his table was the slipper that Master Ambrose had facetiously suggested might be of use to him. He picked it up and stared at it absently. Ambrose had said the sight of it had made Endymion Lear jump out of his skin, and that the reason was obvious. And yet those purple strawberries did not look like fairy fruit. Master Nathaniel had recently become but too familiar with the aspect of that fruit not to recognize it instantly, whatever its variety. Though he had never seen berries exactly like these, he was certain that they did not grow in fairyland. He walked across to his bookcase and took out a big volume bound in vellum. It was a very ancient illustrated herbal of the plants of Doramere. At first he turned its pages somewhat listlessly, as if he did not really expect to find anything of interest. Then, suddenly, he came on an illustration, underneath which was written, "The Berries of Merciful Death." He gave a low whistle, and fetching the slipper, laid it beside the picture. The painted berries and the embroidered ones were identical. On the opposite page, the berries were described in a style that a literary expert would have recognized as belonging to the Duke Aubrey period. The passage ran thus: "The berries of merciful death. These berries are wine-colored and crawl along the ground and have the leaves of wild strawberries. They ripen during the first quarter of the harvest moon, and are only to be found in certain valleys of the west, and even there they grow but sparsely, and for the sake of birds and children and other indiscreet lovers of fruit, it is well that such is the case, for they are a deadly and insidious poison, though very tardy in their action, often lying dormant in the blood for many days. Then the poison begins to speak in itchings of the skin, while the tongue, as though in punishment for the lies it may have told, becomes covered with black spots, so that it has the appearance of the shards of a ladybird, and this is the only warning to the victim that his end is approaching. For if evil things ever partake of the blessed virtues, then we may say that this malign berry is mercifully cruel, in that it spares its victims belchings and retchings and fiery humours and racking colics. And, shortly before his end, he is overtaken by a pleasant drowsiness, yielding to which he falls into a peaceful sleep, which is his last. And now I will give you a receipt which, if you have no sin upon your conscience, and are at peace with the living and the dead, and have never killed a robin, nor robbed an orphan, nor destroyed the nest of a dream, It may be will prove an antidote to that poison, and may be it will not. This, then, is the receipt. Take 1 pint of salad oil and put it into a vial glass, but first wash it with rose water and marigold flower water, the flowers being gathered towards the west. Wash it till the oil comes white, then put it into the glass, and then put thereto the buds of peonies, the flowers of marigold, and the flowers and tops of shepherd's thyme. The thyme must be gathered near the side of a hill where the fairies are said to dance. Master Nathaniel laid down the book, and his eyes were more frightened than triumphant. There was something sinister in the silent language in which dead men told their tales, with sly malice embroidering them on old maids' canvas work, hiding them away in ancient books written long before they were born. And why were his ears so attuned to this dumb speech? For him, the old herbalist had been describing a murderer, subtle, sinister, mitigating dark deeds with mercy. A murderer, the touch of whose bloody hands was balm to the sickened body, and whose voice could rock haunted minds to sleep. And as well, in the light of what he already knew, the old herbalist had told a story. A violent, cruel, reckless woman had wished to rid herself of her enemy by the first means that came to her hand, osiers, the sap of which produced an agonizing, cruel death. But her discreet, though murderous lover took the osiers from her, and gave her instead the berries of merciful death. The herbalist had proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that the villain of the story was Endymion Lear. Yes, but how should he make the dead tell their tale loud enough to reach the ear of the law? In any case, he must leave Lud, and that quickly. Why should he not visit the scene of this old drama, the widow Gibberty's farm? Perhaps he might there find witnesses who spoke a language understood by all. The next morning he ordered a horse to be saddled, packed a few necessaries in a knapsack, and then he told Dame Marigold that, for the present, he could not stay in Lud. "As for you," he said, "you had better move to Polydor's. For the moment, I'm the most unpopular man in town, and it would be just as well that they should think of you as Vigil's sister, rather than as Chanticleer's wife." Dame Marigold's face was very pale that morning, and her eyes were very bright. "Nothing would induce me," she said in a low voice, "ever again to cross the threshold of Polydor's house. I shall never forgive him for the way he has treated you. No, I shall stay here, in your house. And," she added, with a little scornful laugh, "you needn't be anxious about me. I've never yet met a member of the lower classes that was a match for one of ourselves. They fall to heel as readily as a dog. I'm not a bit afraid of the mob, or anything they could do to me." Master Nathaniel chuckled. "By the sun, moon, and stars," he cried proudly, "you're a chip off the old block, Marigold." "Well, don't stay too long away, Nat," she said, "or else when you come back you'll find that I've gone mad like everybody else, and am dancing as wildly as Mother Tibbs, and singing songs about Duke Aubrey." And she smiled her charming, crooked smile. Then he went up to say good-bye to old Hempy. "Well, Hempy," he cried gaily, "Lud's getting too hot for me, so I'm off with a knapsack on my back to seek my fortune like the youngest son in your old stories. Will you wish me luck?" There were tears in the old woman's eyes as she looked at him, and then she smiled. "Why, Master Nat," she cried, "I don't believe you've felt so light-hearted since you were a boy. But these are strange times when a Chanticleer is chased out of Lud-in-the-Mist, and wouldn't I just like to give those Vigils and the rest of them a bit of my mind?" And her old eyes flashed. "But don't you ever get downhearted, Master Nat. And don't ever forget that there have always been Chanticleers in Lud-in-the-Mist, and that there always will be. But it beats me how you're to manage with only 3 pairs of stockings and no one to mend them." "Well, Hempy," he laughed, "they say the fairies are wonderfully neat-fingered, and who knows? Perhaps in my wanderings I may fall in with a fairy housewife who will darn my stockings for me." And he brought out the forbidden word as lightly and easily as if it had been one in daily use. About an hour after Master Nathaniel had ridden away, Luke Hempin arrived at the house, wild-eyed, dishevelled, and with very startling news. But it was impossible to communicate it to Master Nathaniel, as he had left without telling anyone his destination. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Watching the Cows. In the interval between his 2 letters, the one to Hempy and the one to Master Nathaniel, Luke decided that his suspicions had been groundless, for the days at the farm were buzzing by with a soothing hum like that of summer insects, and Ranulph was growing gay and sunburned. Then towards autumn, Ranulph had begun to wilt, and finally Luke overheard the strange conversation he had reported in his letter to Master Nathaniel. And once again the farm grew hateful to him, and he followed Ranulph as if he were his shadow, and counted the hours for the order to come from Master Nathaniel, bidding them return to Lud. Perhaps you may remember that on his first evening at the farm, Ranulph had wanted to join the children who watched the widow's cows at night. But it had evidently been nothing but a passing whim, for he did not express the wish again. And then, at the end of June, as a matter of fact it was Midsummer Day, the widow had asked him if he would not like that night to join the little herdsman. But towards evening had come a steady downfall of rain, and the plan had fallen through. It was not alluded to again till the end of October, 3 or 4 days before Master Nathaniel left Lud-in-the-Mist. It had been a very mild autumn in the west, and the nights were fresh rather than cold, and when, that evening, the little boys came knocking at the door for their bread and cheese, the widow began to jeer at Ranulph in a hearty, jovial way for being town-bred and never having spent a night under the sky. "Why don't you go tonight with the little herdsman? You wanted to when you first came here, and the doctor said it would do you no harm." Now Luke was feeling particularly downcast that night. No answer had come from Master Nathaniel to his letter, though it was well over a week since he had written. He felt forlorn and abandoned, with a weight of responsibility too heavy for his shoulders, and he was certainly not going to add to that weight by allowing Ranulph to run the risk of catching a bad chill. And, as well, any suggestion that came from the widow was greeted by him with suspicion. "Master Ranulph," he cried excitedly, "I can't let you go. His worship and my old auntie wouldn't like it, what with the nights getting damp and all. No, Master Ranulph, be a good little chap, and go to your bed as usual." As he was speaking, he caught Hazel's eye, and she gave him an almost imperceptible nod of approval. But the widow cried, with a loud, scornful laugh, in which Ranulph shrilly joined, "Too damp, indeed, when we haven't had so much as a drop of rain these 4 weeks. Don't let yourself be coddled, Master Ranulph. Young Hempin's nothing but an old maid in breeches. He's as bad as my Hazel. I've always said that if she doesn't die an old maid, it isn't that she wasn't born one." Hazel said nothing, but she fixed her eyes beseechingly on Luke. But Ranulph, I fear, was a very spoiled little boy, and, into the bargain, he dearly loved annoying Luke. So he jumped up and down, shouting, "Old maid Hempin, old maid Hempin, I'm going, so there." "That's right, little master," laughed the widow. "You'll be a man before I am." And the three little herdsmen who had been watching this scene with shy amusement grinned from ear to ear. "Do as you like, then," said Luke sullenly, "but I'm coming too. And anyway, you must wrap up as warmly as you can." So they went upstairs to put on their boots and mufflers. When they came down, Hazel, with compressed lips and a little frown knitting her brows, gave them their rations of cheese and bread and honey, and then, with a furtive glance in the direction of the widow, who was standing with her back turned, talking to the little herdsman, she slipped 2 sprigs of fennel into Luke's buttonhole. "Try and get Master Ranulph to wear one of them," she whispered. This was not reassuring. But how is an under-gardener, not yet turned 18, to curb the spoiled son of his master, especially when a strong-willed elderly woman throws her weight into the other scale? "Well, well," said the widow, bustling up, "it's high time you were off. You have a full 3 miles' walk before you." "Yes, yes, let's be off," cried Ranulph excitedly. Luke felt it would be useless to protest further, so the little cavalcade dived into the moonlit night. The world was looking very beautiful. At one end of the scale of darkness stood the pines like rich black shadows. At the other end of the scale were the farm buildings like white, glimmering human masks. And in between these two extremes were all the various degrees of grayness, the shimmer of the dapple, that was more white than gray, and all the different trees, plane trees, liege oaks, olives, and one could almost recognize their foliage by their lesser or greater degree of density. On they trudged in silence up the course of the dapple, Luke too anxious and aggrieved to talk, Ranulph buried too deep in dreams, and the little herdsman far too shy. There were nothing but rough cattle paths in the valley, heavy enough going by day and doubly so by night, and before they had yet gone half the way, Ranulph's feet began to lag. "Would you like to rest a bit and then go back?" said Luke eagerly. But Ranulph shook his head scornfully and mended his pace. Nor did he allow himself to lag again till they reached their destination, a little oasis of rich pasturage, already on rising ground, though still a mile or 2 away from the hills. Once here, in their own kingdom, as it were, the little herdsmen became lively and natural, laughing and chatting with Ranulph, as they set about repairing such breaches as had been made in the huts by the rough and tumble of 12 odd hours. Then there was wood to be collected, and a fire to be lit, and into these tasks Ranulph threw himself with a gay, though rather feverish, vigor. At last they settled down to their long watch, squatting round the fire, and laughing for sheer love of adventure as good campaigners should. For were there not, marching towards them, some 8 dark hours equipped with who could say what curious weapons from the rich arsenal of night and day? The cattle crouched round them in soft, shadowy clumps, placidly munching and dreaming with wide-open eyes. The narrow zone of color, created by the firelight, was like the planet Earth, a little freak of brightness in a universe of impenetrable shadows. Suddenly, Luke noticed that each of the 3 little herdsmen was, like himself, wearing a sprig of fennel. "I say, why are all you little chaps wearing fennel?" he blurted out. They stared at him in amazement. "But you be wearing a bit yourself, Master Hempin," said Toby, the eldest. "Oh, no," and he could not resist adding in an offhand tone, "it was a present from a young lady. But do you always wear a bit in these parts?" he added. "Always on this night of the year," said the children. And as Luke looked puzzled, Toby cried in surprise, "Don't you wear fennel in Lud on the last night of October?" "No, we don't," answered Luke a little crossly. "And why should we, I should like to know?" "Why," cried Toby in a shocked voice, "because this is the night when the silent people, the dead, you know, come back to Doramere." Ranulph looked up quickly, but Luke scowled. He was sick to death of Western superstitions, and into the bargain he was feeling frightened. He removed the second sprig of fennel given him by Hazel from his buttonhole, and holding it out to Ranulph, said, "Here, Master Ranulph, stick that in your hatband or somewhere." But Ranulph shook his head. "I don't want any fennel, thank you, Luke," he said. "I'm not frightened." The children gazed at him in half-shocked admiration, and Luke sighed gloomily. "Not frightened of the silent people?" queried Toby. "No," answered Ranulph curtly, and then he added, "At least not tonight." "I'll wager the widow Gibberty, at any rate, isn't wearing any fennel," said Luke with a harsh laugh. The children exchanged queer little glances and began to snigger. This aroused Luke's curiosity. "Now then, out with it, youngsters. Why doesn't the widow Gibberty wear fennel?" But their only answer was to nudge each other and snigger behind their fingers. This put Luke on his mettle. "Look here, you bantams," he cried. "Don't you forget that you've got the High Seneschal's son here. And if you know anything about the widow that's a bit fishy, it's your duty to let me know. If you don't, you may find yourselves in jail some day, so you just spit it out." And he glared at them as fiercely as his kindly china blue eyes would allow. They began to look scared. "But the widow doesn't know we've seen anything. And if she found out, and that we've been blabbing, oh my, wouldn't we catch it?" cried Toby, and his eyes grew round with terror at the mere thought. "No, you won't catch it, I'll give you my word," said Luke. "And if you've really anything worth telling, the seneschal will be very grateful, and each of you may find yourselves with more money in your pockets than your 3 fathers put together have ever had in all their lives. And anyhow, to begin with, if you'll tell me what you know, you can toss up for this knife, and there's not a finer one to be found in all Lud." And he waved before their dazzled eyes his greatest treasure, a magnificent 6-bladed knife, given him one Yuletide by Master Nathaniel, with whom he had always been a favourite. At the sight of this marvel of cutlery, the little boys proved venal, and in voices scarcely above a whisper and with frequent frightened glances over their shoulders, as if the widow might be lurking in the shadows listening to them, they told their story. One night, just before dawn, a cow called Cornflower, from the unusually blue color of her hide, who had recently been added to the herd, suddenly grew restless and began to moo, the strange moo of blue cows that was like the cooing of doves, and then rose to her feet and trotted away into the darkness. Now Cornflower was a very valuable cow, and the widow had given them special injunctions to look after her, so Toby, leaving the other 2 to mind the rest of the herd, dashed after her into the thinning darkness, and though she had got a good start of him, was able to keep in her track by the tinkling of her bell. Finally he came on her standing at the brink of the dapple and nozzling the water. He went close up to her, and found that she had got her teeth into something beneath the surface of the stream, and was tearing at it in intense excitement. Just then who should drive up in a cart but the widow and Dr. Endymion Lear. They appeared much annoyed at finding Toby, but they helped him get Cornflower away from the water. Bits of straw were hanging from her mouth, and it was stained with juices of a color he had never seen before. The widow then told him to go back to his companions, and said she would herself take Cornflower back to the herd in the morning. And to account for her sudden appearance on the scene, she said she had come with the doctor to try and catch a very rare fish that only rose to the surface an hour before sunrise. "But you see," went on Toby, "my dad's a great fisherman, and often takes me out with him, but he never told me about this fish in the dapple that can only be caught before sunrise, and I thought I'd just like to have a peep at it. So instead of going back to the others right away, I hid, I did, behind some trees. And they took some nets, they did, out of the cart, but it wasn't fish they drew up in them. No, it wasn't." He was suddenly seized with embarrassment, and he and his two little friends again began to snigger. "Out with it," cried Luke impatiently. "What was in their nets? You'll not get the knife for only half a story, you know." "You say, Dorian," said Toby bashfully, nudging the second eldest boy. But Dorian, too, would only giggle and hang his head. "I don't mind saying," cried Peter, the youngest, valiantly. "It was fairy fruit. That's what it was." Luke sprang to his feet. "Busty Bridget!" he exclaimed in a horrified voice. Ranulph began to chuckle. "Didn't you guess right away what it was, Luke?" he asked. "Yes," went on Peter, much elated by the effect his words had produced. "It was wicker baskets, all full of fairy fruit. I know, because Cornflower had torn off the top of one of them." "Yes," interrupted Toby, beginning to think that little Peter had stolen enough of his thunder. "She had torn off the top of one of the baskets, and I've never seen fruit like it. It was as if colored stars had fallen from the sky into the grass and were making all of the valley bright. And Cornflower, she was eating as if she would never stop. More like a bee among flowers she was than a common cow. And the widow and the doctor, though of course they were put out, they couldn't help laughing to see her. And her milk the next morning, oh my! It tasted of roses and shepherd's thyme. But she never came back to the herd, for the widow sold her to a farmer who lived 20 miles away, and—" But Luke could contain himself no longer. "You little rascals," he cried, "to think of all the trouble there is in Lud just now, and the magistrates and the town guard racking their brains to find out how the stuff gets across the border, and 3 little bantams like you knowing all about it and not telling a soul. Why did you keep it to yourselves like that?" "We were frightened of the widow," said Toby sheepishly. "You won't tell that we've blabbed?" he added, in an imploring voice. "No, I'll see that you don't get into trouble," said Luke. "Here's the knife, and a coin to toss up for it with. Toasted cheese! A nice place this we've come to. Are you sure, young Toby, it was Dr. Lear you saw?" Toby nodded his head emphatically. "Aye, it was Dr. Lear, and no mistake. Here's my hand on it." And he stuck out a brown little paw. "Well, I'm blessed. Dr. Lear!" exclaimed Luke. And Ranulph gave a little mocking laugh. Luke fell into a brown study. Surprise, indignation, and pleasant visions of himself swaggering in Lud, praised and flattered by all as the man who had run the smugglers to earth, chasing each other across the surface of his brain. And in the light of Toby's story, could it be that the stranger whose mysterious conversation with the widow he had overheard was none other than the popular, kindly Dr. Endymion Lear? It seemed almost incredible. But on one thing he was resolved. For once he would assert himself, and Ranulph should not spend another night at the widow Gibberty's farm. Toby won the toss, and pocketed the knife with a grin of satisfaction. And by degrees the talk became as flickering and intermittent as the light of the dying fire, which they were too idle to feed with sticks, and finally it was quenched to silence, and they yielded to the curious drugged sensation that comes from being out of doors and wide awake at night. It was as if the earth had been transported to the sky, and they had been left behind in chaos, and were gazing up at its towns and beasts and heroes flattened out in constellations, and looking like the stippled pictures in a Neolithic cave. And the Milky Way was the only road visible in the universe. Now and then a toad harped on its one silvery note, and from time to time a little breeze would spring up and then die down. Suddenly, Ranulph broke the silence with the startling question, "How far is it from here to Fairyland?" The little boys nudged one another and again began to snigger behind their hands. "For shame, Master Ranulph!" cried Luke indignantly, "talking like that before youngsters." "But I want to know," said Ranulph petulantly. "Tell what your old granny used to say, Dorian," giggled Toby. And Dorian was finally persuaded to repeat the old saying, 1,000 leagues by the Great West Road and 10 by the Milky Way. Ranulph sprang to his feet, and with rather a wild laugh he cried, "Let's have a race to Fairyland. I bet it will be me that gets there first. 1, 2, 3, and away!" And he would actually have plunged off into the darkness, had not the little boys, half shocked, half admiring, flung themselves on him and dragged him back. "There's an imp of mischief got into you tonight, Master Ranulph," growled Luke. "You shouldn't joke about things like that, especially tonight, Master Chanticleer," said Toby gravely. "You're right there, young Toby," said Luke. "I only wish he had half your sense." "It was just a bit of fun, wasn't it, Master Chanticleer? You didn't really want us to race to yonder?" asked little Peter, peering through the darkness at Ranulph with scared eyes. "Of course it was only fun," said Luke. But Ranulph said nothing. Again they lapsed into silence, and all round them, subject to blind, taciturn laws and heedless of man, myriads of things were happening, in the grass, in the trees, in the sky. Luke yawned and stretched himself. "It must be getting near dawn," he said. They had successfully doubled the dangerous cape of midnight, and he began to feel secure of safely weathering what remained of their dark voyage. It was the hour when night watchers begin to idealize their bed, and, with Sancho Panza, to bless the man who invented it. They shuddered and drew their cloaks closer round their shoulders. Then something happened. It was not so much a modification of the darkness as a sigh of relief, a slight relaxing of tension, so that one felt, rather than saw, that the night had suddenly lost a shade of its density. Ah, yes, there, between these two shoulders of the hills, she is bleeding to death. At first the spot was merely a degree less black than the rest of the sky. Then it turned gray, then yellow, then red, and the earth was undergoing the same transformation. Here and there patches of grayness broke out in the blackness of the grass, and after a few seconds one saw that they were clumps of flowers. Then the grayness became filtered with a delicate sea green, and next one realized that the gray-green belonged to the foliage, against which the petals were beginning to show white, and then pink or yellow or blue, but a yellow like that of primroses, a blue like that of certain wild periwinkles, colors so elusive that one suspects them to be due to some passing accident of light, and that were one to pick the flower, it would prove to be pure white. Ah, there can be no doubt of it now. The blues and yellows are real and perdurable. Color is steadily flowing through the veins of the earth, and we may take heart, for she will soon be restored to life again. But had we kept one eye on the sky, we should have noticed that a star was quenched with every flower that reappeared on earth. And now the valley is again red and gold with vineyards. The hills are clothed with pines, and the dapple is rosy. Then a cock crowed, and another answered it, and then another, a ghostly sound which surely did not belong to the smiling, triumphant earth, but rather to one of those distant, dying stars. But what had taken Ranulph? He had sprung to his feet and was standing motionless, a strange light in his eyes. And then again, from a still more distant star, it seemed, another cock crowed, and another answered it. "The piper! The piper!" cried Ranulph in a loud, triumphant voice. And before his astonished companions could get to their feet, he was dashing up one of the bridle paths towards the Debatable Hills. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The Old Goatherd. For a few seconds they stood petrified, and then Luke was seized with panic, and, calling to the little boys to stay where they were, dashed off in pursuit. Up the path he pounded, from time to time shouting angrily to Ranulph to come back, but the distance between them grew ever wider. Luke's ears began to sing, and his brain turned to fire, and he seemed to lose all sense of reality. It was not on the earth that he was running, but through the airless deserts of space. He could not have said how long he struggled on, for he who runs hard leaves time behind as well as space. But finally his strength gave way, and he fell, breathless and exhausted, to the ground. When he had sufficiently recovered to think of starting again, the diminishing speck that had been Ranulph had completely vanished. Poor Luke began to swear at both Ranulph and himself. Just then he heard a tinkle of bells, and down the bridle path came a herd of goats and a very ancient herdsman, to judge at least from his bowed walk, for his face was hidden by a hood. When he had got up to Luke, he stood still, leaning heavily on his stick, and peered down at him from underneath the overhanging flap of his hood, with a pair of very bright eyes. "You've been running hard, young master, by the looks of ye," he said in a quavering voice. "You be the second young fellow as what I've seen running this morning." "The second?" cried Luke eagerly. "Was the other a little lad of about 12 years old, with red hair, in a green leathern jerkin embroidered in gold?" "Well, his hair was red and no mistake, though as to the jerkin—" And here he was seized with a violent attack of coughing, and it took all Luke's patience not to grab him by the shoulders and shake the words out of him. "Though as to the jerkin, my eyes not being as sharp as they once were—" "Oh, never mind about the jerkin," cried Luke. "Did you stop and speak to him?" "But about that jerkin, you do cut an old man short, you do. It might have been green, but then again it might have been yellow. But the young gentleman what I saw was not the one as you're after." "How do you know?" "Why, because he was the seneschal's son, the one I saw," said the old man proudly, as if the fact put him at once into a superior position to Luke. "But it's the seneschal's son, Master Ranulph Chanticleer, that I'm after too," cried Luke eagerly. "How long is it since you saw him? I must catch up with him." "You'll not do that on your 2 feet," said the goatherd calmly. "That young gentleman and his yellow jerkin and his red hair must be well on the way to Moongrass by now." "To Moongrass?" And Luke stared at him in amazement. "Aye, to Moongrass, where the cheeses come from. You see, it was this way. I'm goatherd to the Lud yeomanry what the seneschal has sent to watch the border to keep out you-know-what. And who should come running into their camp about half an hour ago with his red jerkin and his green hair but your young gentleman. 'Halt!' cries the yeoman on guard. 'Let me pass, I'm young Master Chanticleer,' cries he. 'And where are you bound for?' cries the yeoman on guard. 'For Fairyland,' says he. And then didn't they all laugh? And the little chap flew into quite a rage and said he was off to Fairyland and no one should stop him. And of course that just made them laugh all the more. But though they wouldn't let him go to Fairyland, the young rascal—" And here the old man was seized with a paroxysm of wheezy laughter which brought on another bout of coughing. "Well, as I was saying," he went on, when he had recovered, "they wouldn't let him through to Fairyland, but they said they would ride back with him where he came from. 'No, you won't,' says he. 'My dad,' says he, 'don't want me to go back there, never any more.' And he whisks out a letter, signed by the seneschal, bidding him leave the widow Gibberty's farm where he was staying, and go straight off to Farmer Jellygreen's at Moongrass. So one of the yeomen saddled his horse, and the youngster got up behind him, and they set off for Moongrass by one of the cattle paths running northeast, which comes out at about the middle of the road between Swan and Moongrass. So that's that, my young fellow." In his relief, Luke tossed his cap into the air. "The young rascal!" he cried joyfully. "Fancy his never having told me he'd got a letter from his worship, and me expecting that letter for the last 3 days, and getting stomach-ache with worry at its not coming. And saying he was off to a certain place, too. A nice fright he's given me. But thank'ee, Gaffer, thank'ee kindly. And here's something for you to drink the health of Master Ranulph Chanticleer." And with a heart as light as a bird's, he began to retrace his steps down the valley. But what was that faint sound behind him? It sounded suspiciously like the ho-ho-ho of that impudent Willy-Wisp, who for a short time had been one of his worship's grooms. He stopped and looked round. No one was visible, except the old goatherd in the distance leaning on his stick. What he had heard could have been nothing but the distant tinkle of the goat bells. When he reached the farm, he found it in a tumult. The little boys had frightened Hazel out of her wits, and confirmed her worst fears by the news that Master Ranulph had run away towards the hills, and that Master Hempin had run after him. "Granny," cried Hazel, wringing her hands, "a messenger must be sent off post-haste to the seneschal." "Stuff and nonsense!" cried the widow angrily. "You mind your own business, miss. Long before any messenger could reach Lud, the lads will be back safe and sound. Towards the hills, indeed. That Luke Hempin is a regular old woman. It's just a bit of Master Ranulph's fun. He's hiding behind a tree, and will jump out on them with a boo. Never in my life have I heard so much fuss about nothing." And then, turning to the farm servants, who were clustering round the children with scared, excited eyes, she bade them go about their business, and let her hear no more nonsense. Her words sounded like good sense, but for all that they did not convince Hazel. Her deep distrust of the widow was almost as old as herself, and her instinct had told her for some time that the widow was hostile to Ranulph. Never for a moment did Hazel forget that she, not the widow, was the rightful owner of the farm. Should she for once assert her position, and, in direct defiance of the widow, report what had happened to the lawman of the district, and send a messenger to Master Nathaniel? But as everybody knows, legal rights can be but weaklings, puny little child princes, cowed by their bastard uncle's precedent and seniority. No, she must wait till she was of age, or married, or was there any change of condition that could alter her relations with the widow, and destroy the parasite growth of sullen docility, which for as long as she could remember had rotted her volition and warped her actions? Hazel clenched her fists and set her teeth. She would assert herself. She would. Now. At once? Why not give them, say, till noon to come back? Yes, she would give them till noon. But before then, a rather shamefaced Luke arrived with his confession that Master Ranulph had made proper fools of them. "So, Miss Hazel, if you'll give me a bite of something and lend me a horse, I'll go after the young scamp to Moongrass. To think of his giving us the slip like that, and never having told me he'd heard from his father. And there was me expecting a letter from his worship every day telling us to leave at once, and—" Hazel raised her eyebrows. "You were expecting a letter ordering you to leave us? How was that?" Luke turned red and mumbled something inaudible. Hazel stared at him for a few seconds in silence, and then she said quietly, "I am afraid you were wise, if you asked the seneschal to remove Master Ranulph." He gave her a shrewd glance. "Yes, I fear this is no place for Master Ranulph. But if you'd excuse me for being so bold, miss, I'd like to give you a word of warning. Don't you trust that Endymion Lear further than you can see him, and don't you ever let your granny take you out fishing." "Thank you, Master Hempin, but I am quite able to look after myself," said Hazel haughtily. And then an anxious look came into her eyes. I hope that you'll find Master Ranulph safe and sound at Moongrass. It's all so very strange. That old Goatherd, who do you suppose he was? One meets strange people near the Elfin marches. You'll let me know if all is well, won't you?" Luke promised. Hazel's words had dampened his spirits and brought back all his anxiety, and the 15 miles to Moongrass, in spite of a good horse, seemed interminable. Alas, there was no Ranulph at the Jelly Greens farm. But to Luke's bewilderment it turned out that the farmer had been expecting him, as he had, a few days previously, received a letter from Master Nathaniel, from which it was clear that he imagined his son was already at Moongrass. So there was nothing for Luke but, with a heavy heart, to start off the next morning for Lud, where, as we have seen, he arrived a few hours after Master Nathaniel had left it. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Who is Portunus? About halfway to Swan, Master Nathaniel, having tethered his horse to a tree, was reclining drowsily under the shade of another. It was midday, and the further west he rode the warmer it grew. It was rather as if he were riding backward through the months. Suddenly, he was aroused by a dry little laugh, and, looking round, he saw crouching beside him an odd-looking old man with very bright eyes. "By my great-aunt's rump, and who may you be?" inquired Master Nathaniel testily. The old man shut his eyes, gulped several times, and replied, "Who are you? Who is me? Answer my riddle, and come and see." And then he stamped impatiently, as if that had not been what he wished to say. "Some cracked old rustic, I suppose," thought Master Nathaniel, and closed his eyes, in the hopes that when the old fellow saw he was not inclined for conversation, he would go away. But the unwelcome visitor continued to crouch beside him, now and then giving him little jogs in the elbow, which was very irritating when one happened to be hot and tired and longing for 40 winks. "What are you doing?" cried Master Nathaniel irritably. "I milk blue ewes. I reap red flowers. I weave the story of dead hours," answered the old man. "Oh, do you? Well, I wish you'd go now, this moment, and milk your red ewes. I want to go to sleep." And he pulled his hat further down over his eyes, and pretended to snore. But suddenly he sprang to his feet with a yap of pain. The old man had prodded him in his belly, and was standing looking at him out of his startlingly bright eyes, with his head slightly on one side. "Don't you try that on, old fellow," cried Master Nathaniel angrily. "You're a nuisance, that's what you are. Why can't you leave me alone?" The old man pointed eagerly at the tree, making little inarticulate sounds. It was as if a squirrel or a bird had been charged with some message that they could not deliver. Then he crept up to him, put his mouth to his ear, and whispered, "What is it that's a tree and yet not a tree? A man and yet not a man? Who is dumb and yet can tell secrets? Who has no arms and yet can strike?" Then he stepped back a few paces, as if he wished to observe the impression his words had produced, and stood rubbing his hands and cackling gleefully. "I suppose I must humor him," thought Master Nathaniel. So he said good-naturedly, "Well, and what's the answer to your riddle, eh?" But the old man seemed to have lost the power of articulate speech, and could only reiterate eagerly, "Dig, dig, dig." "Dig, dig, dig. So that's the answer, is it? Well, I'm afraid I can't stay here the whole afternoon trying to guess your riddles. If you've got anything to tell me, can't you say it any plainer?" Suddenly, he remembered the old superstition that when the silent people returned to Dormare, they could only speak in riddles and snatches of rhyme. He looked at the old man searchingly. "Who are you?" he said. But the answer was the same as before. "Dig, dig, dig." "Try again. Perhaps after a bit the words will come more easily," said Master Nathaniel. "You are trying to tell me your name." The old man shut his eyes tight, took a long breath, and, evidently making a tremendous effort, brought out very slowly, "Seize your opportunus. Dig, dig. Portunus is my name." "Well, you've got it out at last. So your name is Portunus, is it?" But the old man stamped his foot impatiently. "Hand! Hand!" he cried. "Is it that you want to shake hands with me, old fellow?" asked Master Nathaniel. But the old man shook his head peevishly. "Farm hand," he managed to bring out. "Dig, dig." And then he lapsed into doggerel. Dig and delve, delve and dig, harness the mare to the farmer's gig. Finally, Master Nathaniel gave up trying to get any sense out of him, and untethered his horse. But when he tried to mount, the old man seized the stirrup, and, looking up at him imploringly, repeated, Dig, dig, dig. And Master Nathaniel was obliged to shake him off with some roughness. And even after he had left him out of sight, he could hear his voice in the distance, shouting, Dig! Dig! I wonder what the old fellow is trying to tell me, said Master Nathaniel to himself. On the morning of the following day he arrived at the village of Swan-on-the-Dapple. Here the drama of autumn had only just reached its gorgeous climax, and the yellow and scarlet trees were flaming out their silent, stationary action against the changeless chorus of pines, dark green against the distant hills. By the golden apples of the west, muttered Master Nathaniel, I'd no idea those accursed hills were so near. I'm glad Ranulph's safe away. Having inquired his way to the Gibberties' farm, he struck off the high road into the valley, and very lovely it was looking in its autumn colouring. The vintage was over, and the vines were now golden and red. Some of the narrow oblong leaves of the wild cherry had kept their bottle green, while others, growing on the same twig, had turned to salmon pink, and the mulberries alternated between canary yellow and grass green. The mountain ash had turned a fiery rose, more lovely even than had been its scarlet berries, and often an olive grew beside it, as if ready, lovingly, to quench its fire in its own tender grey. The birches twinkled and quivered, as if each branch were a golden divining rod trembling to secret water, and the path was strewn with olives, looking like black oblong dung. It was one of those mysterious autumn days that are intensely bright though the sun is hidden, and when one looked at these lambent trees, one could almost fancy them the source of the light flooding the valley. From time to time, a tiny yellow butterfly would flit past, like a little yellow leaf shed by one of the birches, and now and then one of the bleeding, tortured-looking lee-jokes would drop an acorn with a little flop, just to remind you, as it were, that it was leading its own serene, vegetable life, oblivious to the agony ascribed to it by the fevered fancy of man. Not a soul did Master Nathaniel pass after he had left the village, though from time to time he saw in the distance labourers following the plough through the vineyards, and their smocks provided the touch of blue that turns a picture into a story. There was blue smoke, too, to tell of human habitations, and an occasional cock strutting up and down in front of one of the red vines, like a salesman before his wares, flaunting, by way of advertisement, a crest of the same material as the vine leaves, but of a more brilliant hue. And in the distance were rushes stuck up in sheaves to dry, and glimmering with the faint whitish, pinky grey of far-away fruit trees in blossom. While, as if the eye had not enough to feed on in her own domain, the sounds even of the valley were pictorial. A tinkling of distant bells conjuring up herds of goats, the ominous melancholy roar which tells that somewhere a waggoner is goading on his oxen, and the distant bark of dogs that paints a picture of homesteads and sunny porches. As Master Nathaniel jogged leisurely along, his thoughts turned to the farmer Gibberty, who many a time must have jogged along this path in just such a way, and seen and heard the very same things that he was seeing and hearing now. Yes, the farmer Gibberty had once been a real living man like himself, and so had millions of others, whose names he had never heard. And one day he himself would be a prisoner, confined between the walls of other people's memory, and then he would cease even to be that, and become nothing but a few words cut in stone. What would these words be, he wondered? A sudden longing seized him to hold Ranulph again in his arms. How pleasant would have been the thought that he was waiting to receive him at the farm. But he must be nearing his journey's end, for in the distance he could discern the figure of a woman leisurely scrubbing her washing on one of the sides of a stone trough. "I wonder if that's the widow," thought Master Nathaniel, and a slight shiver went down his spine. But as he came nearer, the washerwoman proved to be quite a young girl. He decided she must be the granddaughter, Hazel, and so she was. He drew up his horse beside her and asked if this were the widow Gibberty's farm. "Yes, sir," she answered shortly, with that half-frightened, half-defiant look that was so characteristic of her. "Why, then, I've not been misdirected. But though they told me I'd find a thriving farm and a fine herd of cows, the fools forgot to mention that the farmer was a rose in petticoats." And he winked jovially. Now, this was not Master Nathaniel's ordinary manner with young ladies, which, as a matter of fact, was remarkably free from flirtatious facetiousness. But he had invented a role to play at the farm, and was already beginning to identify himself with it. As it turned out, this opening compliment was a stroke of luck. For Hazel bitterly resented that she was not recognized as the lawful owner of the farm, and Master Nathaniel's greeting of her as the farmer thawed her coldness into dimples. "If you've come to see over the farm, I'm sure we'll be very pleased to show you everything," she said graciously. Thank ye kindly. I'm a cheesemonger from Lud-in-the-Mist, and there's no going to sleep quietly behind one's counter these days in trade, if one's to keep one's head above the water. It's competition, missy, competition that keeps old fellows like me awake. Why, I can remember when there weren't more than 6 cheesemongers in the whole of Lud, and now there are as many in my street alone. So I thought I'd come myself and have a look round, and see where I could get the best dairy produce. There's nothing like seeing for oneself." And here he launched into an elaborate and gratuitous account of all the other farms he had visited on his tour of inspection. But the one that had pleased him best, he said, had been that of a very old friend of his, and he named the farmer near Moongrass with whom, presumably, Ranulph and Luke were now staying. Here Hazel looked up eagerly, and, in rather an unsteady voice, asked if he'd seen 2 lads there, a big one and a little one who was the son of the seneschal. "Do you mean little Master Ranulph Chanticleer and Luke Hempin? Why, of course I saw them. It was they who told me to come along here, and very grateful I am to them, for I have found something well worth looking at." A look of indescribable relief flitted over Hazel's face. Oh, I'm so glad you saw them," she faltered. "Aha! My friend Luke has evidently been making good use of his time, the young dog," thought Master Nathaniel, and he proceeded to retail a great many imaginary sayings and doings of Luke at his new abode. Hazel was soon quite at home with the jovial, facetious old cheesemonger. She always preferred elderly men to young ones, and was soon chatting away with the abandon sometimes observable when naturally confiding people, whom circumstances have made suspicious, find someone whom they think they can trust. And Master Nathaniel was, of course, drinking in every word, and longing to be in her shoes. "But, missy, it seems all work and no play," he cried at last. "Do you get no frolics and junketings?" "Sometimes we dance of an evening, when old Portunus is here," she answered. "Portunus?" he cried sharply. "Who's he?" But this question froze her back into reserve. "An old weaver with a fiddle," she answered stiffly. "A bit doited?" Her only answer was to look at him suspiciously and say, Do you know Portunus, sir?"
"Well, I believe I met him, about halfway between here and Lud. The old fellow seemed to have something on his mind, but couldn't get it out. I've known many a parrot that talked better than he."
"Oh, I've often thought that, too. That he'd something on his mind, I mean," cried Hazel, on another wave of confidence. "It's as if he were trying hard to tell one something, and he often follows me as if he wanted me to do something for him, and sometimes I think I should try and help him, and not be so harsh with him, but he just gives me the creeps, and I can't help it."
"He gives you the creeps, does he?"
"That he does," she cried with a little shiver. "To see him gorging himself with green fruit. It isn't like a human being the way he does it. It's like an insect or a bird. And he's like a cat, too, in the way he always follows about the folk that don't like him. Oh, he's nasty, and he's spiteful, too, and mischievous. But perhaps that's not to be wondered at if—" And she broke off abruptly.
Master Nathaniel gave her a keen look. "If what?"
he said. "Oh, well, just silly talk of the country people," said Hazel evasively.
"That he's, for instance, one of what you call the silent people?"
"How did you know?" And Hazel looked at him suspiciously.
"Oh, I guessed. You see, I've heard a lot of that sort of talk since I've been in the West. Well, the old fellow certainly seemed to have something he wanted to tell me, but I can't say he was very explicit. He kept saying over and over again, 'Dig, dig.'"
"Oh, that's his great word," cried Hazel. "The old women round about say that he's trying to tell one his name. You see, they think that, well, that he's a dead man come back, and that when he was on earth he was a labourer, by name Diggory Carp."
"Diggory Carp?"
cried Master Nathaniel sharply. Hazel looked at him in surprise. "Did you know him, sir?" she asked.
No, not exactly. But I seem to have heard the name somewhere, though I dare say in these parts it's a common enough one. Well, and what do they say about this Diggory Carp?"
Hazel looked a little uneasy. "They don't say much, sir, to me. I sometimes think there must have been some mystery about him. But I know that he was a merry, kind sort of man, well liked all round, and a rare fiddler. But he came to a sad end, though I never heard what happened exactly. And they say," and here she lowered her voice mysteriously, "that once a man joins the silent people, he becomes mischievous and spiteful, however good-natured he may have been when he was alive. And if he'd been unfairly treated, as they say he was, it would make him all the more spiteful, I should think. I often think he's got something he wants to tell us, and I sometimes wonder if it's got anything to do with the old stone herm in our orchard. He's so fond of dancing round it."
"Really? And where is this old herm? I want to see all the sights of the country, you know. Get my money's worth of travel."
And Master Nathaniel donned again the character of the cheerful cheesemonger, which in the excitement of the last few minutes he had unwittingly sloughed. As they walked to the orchard, which was some distance from the washing trough, Hazel said nervously, "Perhaps you hadn't heard, sir, but I live here with my granny. At least, she isn't my real granny, though I call her so, and, well, she seems fond of old Portunus, and perhaps it would be as well not to mention to her that you had met him."
"Very well. I won't mention him to her, at present."
And he gave her rather a grim little smile. Though the orchard had been stripped of its fruit, what with the red and yellow leaves, and the marvellous ruby red of the lateral branches of the peach trees, there was colour enough in the background of the old grey herm. And, in addition, there twisted around him the scarlet and gold of a vine. "I often think he's the spirit of the farm," said Hazel shyly, looking to see if Master Nathaniel was admiring her old stone friend. To her amazement, however, as soon as his eyes fell on it, he clapped his hand against his thigh and burst out laughing. "By the sun, moon, and stars," he cried,
Here's the answer to Portunus's riddle. The tree, yet not a tree. The man, yet not a man."
And he repeated to Hazel the one consecutive sentence that Portunus had managed to enunciate. "Who has no arms and yet can strike? Who is dumb and yet can tell secrets?" she repeated after him. "Can you strike and tell secrets, old friend?" she asked whimsically, stroking the grey lichened stone. And then she blushed and laughed, as if to apologize for this exhibition of childishness. With country hospitality, Hazel presumed that their uninvited guest had come to spend several days at the farm, and accordingly she had his horse taken to the stables, and ordered the best room to be prepared for his use. The widow, too, gave him a hearty welcome, when he came down to the midday meal in the big kitchen. When they had been a few minutes at table, Hazel said, "Oh, Granny, this gentleman has just come from the farm near Moongrass where little Master Chanticleer and young Hempen have gone, and he says they were both of them blooming, and sent us kind messages."
"Yes," said Master Nathaniel cheerfully, ever ready to start romancing. "My old friend the farmer is delighted with them. The talk in Lud was that little Chanticleer had been ill, but all I can say is you must have done wonders for him. His face is as round and plump as a moongrass cheese."
"Well, I'm glad you're pleased with the young gentleman's looks, sir," said the widow in a gratified voice. But in her eyes there was the gleam of a rather disquieting smile. Dinner over, the widow and Hazel had to go and attend to their various occupations, and Master Nathaniel went and paced up and down in front of the old house, thinking. Over and over again his thoughts returned to the odd old man, Portunus. Was it possible that he had really once been Diggory Carp, and that he had returned to his old haunts to try and give a message? It was characteristic of Master Nathaniel that the metaphysical possibilities of the situation occupied him before the practical ones. If Portunus were indeed Diggory Carp, then these stubble fields and vineyards, these red and golden trees, would be robbed of their peace and stability. For he realized at last that the spiritual balm he had always found in silent things was simply the assurance that the passions and agonies of man were without meaning, roots, or duration, no more part of the permanent background of the world than the curls of blue smoke that from time to time were wafted through the valley from the autumn bonfires of weeds and rubbish, and that he could see winding like blue raves in and out of the foliage of the trees. Yes, their message, though he had never till now heard it distinctly, had always been that fairyland was nothing but delusion. There was life and death, and that was all. And yet, had their message always comforted him? There had been times when he had shuddered in the company of the silent things. "Aye, aye," he murmured dreamily to himself, and then he sighed. But he had yielded long enough to vain speculations. There were things to be done. Whether Portunus were the ghost of Diggory Carp or merely a doited old weaver, he evidently knew something that he wanted to communicate, and it was connected with the orchard herm. Of course, it might have nothing whatever to do with the murder of the late Farmer Gibberty, but with the memory of the embroidered slipper fresh in his mind, Master Nathaniel felt it would be rank folly to neglect a possible clue. He went over in his mind all the old man's words. Dig, dig. That word had been the ever-recurring burden. Then he had a sudden flash of inspiration. Why should not the word be taken in its primary meaning? Why, instead of the first syllable of Diggory Carp, should it not be merely an order to dig, with a spade or a shovel? In that case, it was clear that the place to dig in was under the herm, and he decided that he would do so as soon as an opportunity presented itself. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The Northern Firebox and Dead Men's Tales. That night, Hazel could not get to sleep. Perhaps this was due to having noticed something that afternoon that made her vaguely uneasy. The evenings were beginning to be chilly, and, shortly before supper, she had gone up to Master Nathaniel's room to light his fire. She found the widow and one of the maidservants there before her, and, to her surprise, they had brought down from the attic an old charcoal stove that had lain there unused for years, for Dorrimere was a land of open fires, and stoves were practically unknown. The widow had brought the stove to the farm on her marriage, for, on her mother's side, she had belonged to a race from the far north. On Hazel's look of surprise, she had said casually, "The logs are dampish today, and I thought this would make our guest cozier." Now Hazel knew that the wood was not in the least damp. How could it be, as it had not rained for days? But that this should have made her uneasy was a sign of her deep, instinctive distrust of her grandfather's widow. Perhaps the strongest instinct in Hazel was that of hospitality, that all should be well, physically and morally, with the guests under the roof that she never forgot was hers, was a need in her much more pressing than any welfare of her own. Meanwhile, Master Nathaniel, somewhat puzzled by the outlandish apparatus that was warming his room, had got into bed. He did not immediately put out his candle. He wished to think. For being much given to reverie, when he wanted to follow the sterner path of consecutive thought, he liked to have some tangible object on which to focus his eye, a visible goal, as it were, to keep his feet from straying down the shadowy paths that he so much preferred. Tonight it was the fine embossed ceiling on which he fixed his eye, the same ceiling at which Ranulph used to gaze when he had slept in this room. On a ground of a rich claret color, patterned with azure arabesques, knobs of a dull gold were embossed, and at the four corners clustered bunches of grapes and scarlet berries in stucco. And though time had dulled their color, and robbed the clusters of many of their berries, they remain nevertheless pretty and realistic objects. But in spite of the light, the focus, and his desire for hard thinking, Master Nathaniel found his thoughts drifting down the most fantastic paths. And besides, he was so drowsy, and his limbs felt so strangely heavy. The colors on the ceiling were getting all blurred, and the old knobs were detaching themselves from their background and shining in space like suns, moons, and stars. Or was it like apples, the golden apples of the West? And now the claret-colored background was turning into a red field, a field of red flowers, from which leered Portunus, and among which wept Ranulph. But the straight road, which for the last few months had been the projection of his unknown buried purpose, even through this confused landscape, glimmered white. Yet it looked different from usual. Why, of course, it was the Milky Way. And then he knew no more. In the meantime, Hazel had been growing more and more restless, and, though she scolded herself for foolishness, more and more anxious. Finally she could stand it no more. "I think I'll just creep up to the gentleman's door and listen if I can hear him snoring," she said to herself. Hazel believed that it was a masculine peculiarity not to be able to sleep without snoring. But though she kept her ear to the keyhole for a full 2 minutes, not a sound proceeded from Master Nathaniel's room. Then she softly opened the door. A lighted candle was guttering to its end, and her guest was lying, to all appearance, dead, whilst a suffocating atmosphere pervaded the room. Hazel felt almost sick with terror, but she flung open the casement window as wide as it would go, poured half the water from the ewer into the stove to extinguish its fire, and the remainder over Master Nathaniel himself. To her unspeakable relief, he opened his eyes, groaned, and muttered something inaudible. "Oh, sir, you're not dead, then," almost sobbed Hazel. "I'll just go and fetch you a cup of cordial, and get you some hartshorn." When she returned with the 2 restoratives, she found Master Nathaniel sitting up in bed, and, though he looked a little fuddled, his natural colour was creeping back, and the cordial restored him to almost his normal condition. When Hazel saw that he was really himself again, she sank down on the floor and, spent with terror, began to sob bitterly. "Come, my child," said Master Nathaniel kindly. "There's nothing to cry about. I'm feeling as well as ever I did in my life, though by the harvest of souls, I can't imagine what can have taken me. I never remember to have swooned before in all my born days." But Hazel would not be comforted. "That it should have happened here in my house," she sobbed. "We who have always stood by the laws of hospitality. And not a young gentleman either. Oh, dearie me! Oh, dearie me!" "What do you blame to yourself, my child?" asked Master Nathaniel. "Your hospitality is in no sense to blame if, owing perhaps to recent fatigues and anxieties, I should have turned faint. No, it is not you that are the bad host, but I that am the bad guest, to have given so much trouble." But Hazel's sobs only grew wilder. "I didn't like her bringing in that firebox. No, I didn't. An evil, outlandish thing that it is. That it should have happened under my roof, for it is my roof, and she'll not pass another night under it." And she sprang to her feet with clenched fists and blazing eyes. Master Nathaniel was becoming interested. "Are you alluding to your grandfather's widow?" he asked quietly. "Yes, I am," cried Hazel indignantly. "Oh, she's up to strange tricks, always. And none of her ways are those of honest farmers. No fennel over our doors, unholy fodder in our granary, and in her heart thoughts as unholy. I saw the smile with which she looked at you at dinner." "Are you accusing this woman of actually having made an attempt on my life?" he asked slowly. But Hazel flinched before this point-blank question, and her only answer was to begin again to cry. For a few minutes Master Nathaniel allowed her to do so unmolested, and then he said gently, "I think you have cried enough for tonight, my child. You have been kindness itself, but it is evident that I am not very welcome to your grandfather's widow, so I must not inflict myself longer upon her. But before I leave her roof there is something I want to do, and I shall need your help." Then he told her who he was, and how he wanted to prove something against a certain enemy of his, and had come here hoping to find a missing clue. He paused, and looked at her meditatively. "I think I ought to tell you, my child," he went on, "that if I can prove what I want, your grandmother may also be involved. Did you know she had once been tried for the murder of your grandfather?" "Yes," she faltered. "I've heard that there was a trial. But I thought she was proved innocent." "Yes, but there is such a thing as a miscarriage of justice. I believe that your grandfather was murdered, and that my enemy, whose name I don't care to mention till I have more to go upon, had a hand in the matter. And I have a shrewd suspicion that the widow was his accomplice. Under these circumstances, will you still be willing to help me?" Hazel first turned red, and then she turned white, and her lower lip began to tremble. She disliked the widow, but had to admit that she had never been unkindly treated by her, and, though not her own kith and kin, She was the nearest approach to a relative she could remember. But on the other hand, Hazel belonged by tradition and breed to the votaries of the grim cult of the law. Crime must not go unpunished. Moreover, and here Hazel subscribed to a still more venerable code, one's own kith and kin must not go unavenged. But the very vehemence with which she longed to be rid of the widow's control had bred a curious, irrational sense of guilt with regard to her, and, into the bargain, she was terrified of her. Supposing this clue should lead to nothing, and the widow discover that they had been imagining? How, in that case, should she dare to face her, to go on living under the same roof with her? And yet, she was certain she had tried to murder their guest that night. How dared she? How dared she? Hazel clenched her fists, and in a little gasping voice said, "Yes, sir, I'll help you."
"Good," said Master Nathaniel briskly. "I want to take old Portunus's advice, and dig under that herm in the orchard this very night. Though, mind you, it's just as likely as not to prove nothing but the ravings of a crazy mind. Or else it may concern some buried treasure, or something else that has nothing to do with your grandfather's murder. But in the case of our finding a valuable bit of evidence, we must have witnesses. And I think we should have the lawman of the district with us. Who is he?"
"It's the Swan blacksmith, Peter Pease."
"Is there any servant you trust whom you could send for him? Someone more attached to you than to the widow?"
"I can trust them all, and they all like me best," she answered.
"Good. Go and wake a servant, and send him off at once for the blacksmith. Tell him not to bring him up to the house, but to take him straight to the orchard. We don't want to wake the widow before need be. And the servant can stay and help us with the job. The more witnesses, the better."
Hazel felt as if she was in a strange, rather terrible dream. But she crept up to the attic and aroused one of the unmarried laborers, who, according to the old custom, slept in their master's house, and bade him ride into Swan and bring the blacksmith back with him on important business concerning the law. Hazel calculated that he should get to Swan and back in less than an hour, and she and Master Nathaniel crept out of the house to wait for them in the orchard, each provided with a spade. The moon was on the wane, but still sufficiently full to give a good light. She was, indeed, an orchard thief, for no fruit being left to rob, she had robbed the leaves of all their color.
"Poor old moon," chuckled Master Nathaniel, who was now in the highest of spirits, "always filching colors with which to paint her own pale face, and all in vain. But just look at your friend, at Master Herm. He does look knowing."
For in the moonlight, the old Herm had found his element, and under her rays his stone flickered and glimmered into living silver flesh, while his archaic smile had gained a new significance. "Excuse me, sir," said Hazel timidly, "but I couldn't help wondering if the gentleman you suspected was Dr. Lear."
"What makes you think so?" asked Master Nathaniel sharply.
"I don't quite know," faltered Hazel. "I just wondered." Before long they were joined by the laborer and the lawman blacksmith, a burly, jovial, red-haired rustic of about 50.
"Good evening," cried Master Nathaniel briskly. "I am Nathaniel Chanticleer."
He was sure that the news of his deposition could not yet have had time to travel to Swan.
"And if my business were not very pressing and secret, I would not, you may be sure, have had you roused from your bed at this ungodly hour. I have reason to think that something of great importance may be hidden under this herm, and I wanted you to be there to see that our proceedings are all in order."
And he laughed genially.
"And here's the guarantee that I'm no masquerader."
And he removed his signet ring and held it out to the blacksmith. It was engraved with his well-known crest, and with 6 chevrons, in token that 6 of his ancestors had been high seneschals of Dormer. Both the blacksmith and the laborer were at first quite overwhelmed by learning his identity. But he pressed a spade into the hand of each, and begged them to begin digging without further delay. For some time they toiled away in silence, and then one of the spades came against something hard. It proved to be a small iron box with a key attached to it.
"Out with it! Out with it!" cried Master Nathaniel excitedly. "I wonder if it contains a halter. By the sun, moon, and stars, I wonder."
But he was sobered by a glimpse of poor Hazel's scared face.
"Forgive me, my child," he said gently. "My thirst for revenge has made me forget both decency and manners. And, as like as not, there will be nothing in it but a handful of Duke Aubrey crowns, the nest egg of one of your ancestors."
They unlocked the box and found that it contained nothing but a sealed parchment package, addressed thus: "To the first who finds me."
"I think, Miss Hazel, it should be you who opens it. Don't you agree, Master Lawman?" said Master Nathaniel.
So, with trembling fingers, Hazel broke the seal, tore open the wrapper, and drew out a sheet of writing. By the light of the blacksmith's lanthorn, they read as follows: "I, Jeremiah Gibberty, farmer and lawman of the district of Swan-on-the-Dapple, having ever been a merry man who loved his joke, do herein crack my last this side of the Debatable Hills, in the hopes that it will not lie so long in the damp earth as to prove but a lame rocket when the time comes to fire it off. And this is my last joke, and may all who hear it hold their sides, and may the tears run down their cheeks. I, Jeremiah Gibberty, was wilfully murdered by my second wife, Clementina, daughter of Ralph Baldbreeches, sailor, and an outlandish woman from the far north. In the which crime she was aided by her lover, Christopher Pugwalker, a foreigner who called himself an herbalist. And I know by sundry itchings of my skin which torment me as I write, and by my spotted tongue, that I have been given what the folks who know them call death-berries, and they were boiled down to look like mulberry jelly, offered to me by my dear wife, and of which I ate in my innocence. And I bid him who finds this writing to search for a little lad, by name Peter Pease, the son of a tipsy tinker. For this little lad, having an empty stomach and being greedy for pence, came to me but an hour ago with a basket full of these same deathberries, and asked me if I should like to buy them. And I, to test him, asked him if he thought there was a blight in my orchard, that I should be so hard put to it for fruit. And he said he thought we must like them up at Gibberty's, for he had seen the gentleman who lived with us, Christopher Pugwalker, but a week since, gathering them. And if Christopher Pugwalker should leave these parts, then let the law search for a dumpy fellow with nut-brown hair, a pug-nose freckled like a robin's egg, and one eye brown, the other blue. And in order that my last joke may be a well-built one, I have tested the berries I bought from the little lad, though it wrung my heart to do so, on one of the rabbits of a certain little maid, by name Marjorie Beach, the daughter of my carter, and I have done so because she, being 7 years old and a healthy lass, runs a good chance of being still this side of the hills when someone digs up this buried jest. And if she be alive, she will not have forgotten how one of her rabbits took to scratching itself, and how its tongue was spotted like a snake, and how she found it lying dead. And I humbly beg her pardon for having played such a cruel trick on a little maid, and I ask my heirs, if so be any of them still alive, to send her a fine buck rabbit, a ham, and 10 gold pieces. And though I am lawman, and could put them under arrest before I die, yet, for a time, I hold my hand, partly because I have been a hunter all my life, and as the hare and deer are given their chance to escape, so shall they have theirs, and partly because I should like to be very far on my wanderings down the Milky Way before Clementina mounts Duke Aubrey's wooden horse, because I think the sound of her strangling would hurt my ears, and, last of all, because I am very weary. And here I sign my name, for the last time. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Belling the Cat. When they had finished reading, Hazel burst into hysterical sobs, crying alternately, "Poor grandfather!" and "Will they hang her for it?" Master Nathaniel soothed her as best he could, and when she had dried her eyes, she said, "Poor Marjorie Beach! She must have that ham and that buck rabbit." "She's still alive, then?" asked Master Nathaniel eagerly. Hazel nodded. "She is poor, and still a maid, and lives in Swan." "And what about Peter Pease, the tinker's smart little lad? Is there nothing for him, Miss Hazel?" cried the blacksmith with a twinkle. Hazel stared at him in bewilderment, and Master Nathaniel cried gleefully, "Why, it's the same name, by the harvest of souls! Were you, then, the little chap who saw Pugwalker picking the berries?" And Hazel said in slow amazement, "You were the little boy who spoke to my grandfather that night? I never thought—" "That I'd begun so humbly, eh? Yes, I was the son of a tinker, or, as they like to be called, of a white smith, and now I'm a blacksmith, and as white is better than black, I suppose I've come down in the world." And he winked merrily. "And you remember the circumstances alluded to by the late farmer?" asked Master Nathaniel eagerly. "That I do, my lord seneschal, as well if they had happened yesterday. I won't easily forget the farmer's face that night when I offered him my basketful. But though the deathberries are rare enough, I found them in those days commoner to pick up than halfpence. And I won't easily forget Master Pugwalker's face either, while he was plucking them. And little did he know there was a squirrel watching him with a good Dorrimere tongue in his head." "Have you ever seen him since?" The blacksmith winked. "Come, come," cried Master Nathaniel impatiently. "Have you ever seen him since? This is no time for beating around the bush." "Well, perhaps I have," said the blacksmith slowly, "trotting about Swan, as brisk and as pleased with himself as a fox with a goose in his mouth. And I've often wondered whether it wasn't my duty as a lawman to speak out. But after all, it was very long ago, and his life seemed to be of better value than his death, for he was a wonderfully clever doctor, and did a powerful lot of good." It was Dr. Lear, then?" asked Hazel in a low voice, and the blacksmith winked. "Well, I think we should be getting back to the house," said Master Nathaniel. "There's still some business before us." And, lowering his voice, he added, "Not very pleasant business, I fear." "I suppose your honour means belling the cat," said the blacksmith, adding with a rueful laugh, "I can't imagine a nastier job. She's a cat with claws." As they walked up to the house, the labourer whispered to Hazel, "Please, missy, does it mean that the mistress killed her husband? They always say so in the village, but—" "Don't, Ben, don't. I can't bear talking about it," cried Hazel with a shudder. And when they reached the house, she ran up to her own bedroom and locked herself in. Ben was despatched to get a stout coil of rope, and Master Nathaniel and the blacksmith, whom the recent excitement had made hungry, began to forage around for something to eat. Suddenly a voice at the door said, "And what, may I ask, are you looking for in my larder, gentlemen?" It was the widow. First she scrutinized Master Nathaniel, a little pale and hollow-eyed perhaps, but alive and kicking for all that. Then her eyes travelled to Peter Pease. At that moment Ben entered with the rope, and Master Nathaniel nudged the lawman, who, clearing his throat, cried in the expressionless falsetto of the law, "Clementina Gibberty, in the name of the country of Dormare, and to the end that the dead, the living, and those not yet born, may rest quietly in their graves, their bed, and the womb, I arrest you for the murder of your late husband, Jeremiah Gibberty." She turned deadly pale, and for a few seconds stood glaring at him in deadly silence. Then she gave a scornful laugh. "What new joke of yours is this, Peter Pease? I was accused of this before, as you know well, and acquitted, with the judge's compliments, and as good as an apology. Law business must be very slack in Swan that you've nothing better to do than to come and frighten a poor woman in her own house with old spiteful tales that were silenced once and for all nearly 40 years ago. My late husband died quietly in his bed, and I only hope you may have as peaceful an end. And you must know very little of the law, Peter Pease, if you don't know that a person can't be tried twice for the same crime." Then Master Nathaniel stepped forward. "You were tried before," he said quietly, "for poisoning your husband with the sap of osiers. This time it will be for poisoning him with the berries of merciful death. Tonight the dead have found their tongues." She gave a wild shriek, which reached upstairs to Hazel's room and caused her to spring into bed and pull the blankets over her ears, as if it had been a thunderstorm. Master Nathaniel signed to Ben, who, grinning from ear to ear, as is the way of rustics when witnessing a painful and embarrassing scene, came up to his mistress with the coil of rope. But to bind her, he needed the aid of both the blacksmith and Master Nathaniel, for, like a veritable wildcat, she struggled and scratched and bit. When her arms were tightly bound, Master Nathaniel said, "And now I will read you the words of the dead." She was for the time worn out by her struggles, and her only answer was an insolent stare, and he produced the farmer's document and read it through to her. "And now," he said, eyeing her curiously, "shall I tell you who gave me the clue without which I should never have found that letter? It was a certain old man whom I think you know, by name Portunus." Her face turned as pale as death, and in a low voice of horror she cried, "Long ago I guessed who he was, and feared that he might prove my undoing." Then her voice grew shrill with terror, and her eyes became fixed, as if seeing some hideous vision. "The silent people," she screamed, "the dumb who speak, the bound who strike. I cherished and fed old Portunus like a tame bird, but what do the dead know of kindness?" "If old Portunus is he whom you take him to be, I fail to see that he has much cause for gratitude," said Master Nathaniel dryly. "Well, he has taken his revenge on you and your accomplice." "My accomplice?" "Aye, on Endymion Lear." "Oh, Lear!" And she laughed scornfully. "It was a greater than Endymion Lear who ordered the death of Farmer Gibberty." "Indeed?" "Yes, one who cares not for good and evil, and sows his commands like grain." "Whom do you mean?" Again she laughed scornfully. "Not one whom I would name to you, but set your mind at rest. He cannot be summoned in a court of law." She gave him a searching look and said abruptly, "Who are you?" "My name is Nathaniel Chanticleer." I thought as much, she cried triumphantly. I wasn't sure, but I thought I'd take no risks. However, you seem to bear a charmed life.
I suppose you are alluding to your kind thought for my comfort? Putting that nice little death-box in my room to keep me warm, eh?
Yes, that's it, she answered brazenly. Then a look of indescribable malice came into her face, and with an evil smile she said, You see, you gave yourself away, without knowing it, at dinner.
Indeed. And how, may I ask?
At first she did not answer, but eyed him gloatingly as a cat might eye a mouse. And then she said slowly, It was that pack of lies you told me about the doings of the lads at Moongrass. Your son isn't at Moongrass, nor ever has been, nor ever will be.
What do you mean?
He cried hoarsely. Mean, she said, with a shrill, triumphant laugh. I mean this. On the night of the 31st of October, when the silent people are abroad, he heard Duke Aubrey's summons and followed it across the hills.
Woman, what? What? Speak, or— And the veins in Master Nathaniel's temples were swelling, and a fire seemed to have been lighted in his brain.
Her laughter redoubled. You'll never see your son again, she jeered. Young Ranulph Chanticleer has gone to the land whence none returns. Not for a moment did he doubt the truth of her words. Before his inward eye there flashed the picture he had seen in the pattern on the ceiling just before losing consciousness. Ranulph weeping among the fields of gillyflowers. A horror of impotent tenderness swept over him, while with the surface of his mind he supposed that this was it springing out at him at last. And parallel with the agony, and in no way mitigating it, was a sense of relief, the relaxing of tension when one can say, Well, it has come at last. He turned a dull eye on the widow, and said, a little thickly, The land from which no one returns? But I can go there too. Follow him across the hills? She cried scornfully. No, you are not made of that sort of stuff. He beckoned to Peter Pease, and they went out together to the front of the house. The cocks were crowing, and there was a feeling of dawn in the air. I want my horse, he said dully, and can you find Miss Hazel for me? But as he spoke she joined them, pale and wild-eyed. From my room I heard you coming out, she said. Is it over? Master Nathaniel nodded, and then, in a quiet voice emptied of all emotion, he told her what he had just learned from the widow. She went still paler than before, and her eyes filled with tears. Then, turning to Peter Pease, he said, You will immediately get out a warrant for the apprehension of Endymion Lear, and send it into Lud to the new mayor, Master Polydore Vigil. And you, Miss Hazel, you'd better leave this place at once. You will have to be plaintiff in the trial. Go to your aunt, Mistress Ivy Peppercorn, who keeps the village shop at Mothgreen. And remember, you must say nothing whatever about the part I've played in this business. That is essential. I am not popular at present in Lud. And now would you kindly order my horse saddled and brought round? There was something so colourless, so dead in his voice, that both Hazel and the smith stood for a few seconds in awed and sympathetic silence, and then Hazel went off slowly to order his horse. You didn't mean what you said to the widow, sir, about going yonder? Asked Peter Pease in an awed voice. Suddenly the fire was rekindled in Master Nathaniel's eyes, and he cried fiercely, Aye, yonder, and beyond yonder, if need be, till I find my son. It did not take long for his horse to be saddled and led to the door. "Goodbye, my child," he said to Hazel, taking her hand. And then he added with a smile, "You dragged me back last night from the Milky Way, and now I am going by the earthly one." She and Peter stood watching him, riding along the valley towards the Debatable Hills, till he and his horse were just a speck in the distance. "Well, well," said Peter Pease, "I warrant it'll be the first time in the history of Doramere that a man has loved his son well enough to follow him yonder." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The law crouches and springs. Literally, Master Polydore Vigil received the severest shock of his life when, a few days after the events recorded in the last chapter, there reached him the warrant against Endymion Lear, duly signed and sealed by the lawman of the district of Swan-on-the-Dapple. Dame Marigold had been right in saying that her brother was now completely under the dominion of the doctor. Master Polydore was a weak, idle man, who, nevertheless, dearly loved the insignia of authority. Hence, his present position was for him an ideal one. He had all the glory due to the first citizen, who has, moreover, effected a coup d'etat, and none of the real responsibility that such a situation entails. And now, this terrible document had arrived. It was like an attempt to cut off his right hand. His first instinct on receiving it was to rush off and take counsel with Endymion Lear himself. Surely the omniscient, resourceful doctor would be able to reduce to wind and thistledown even a thing as solid as a warrant. But respect for the law, and the belief that though everything else may turn out vanity and delusion, the law has the terrifying solidity of reality itself, were deep-rooted in Master Polydore. If there was a warrant out against Endymion Lear, well, then he must bend his neck to the yoke like any other citizen and stand his trial. Again he read through the warrant, in hopes that on a second it would lose its reality, prove to be a forgery or a hoax. Alas! Its genuineness was but too unmistakable. The law had spoken. Master Polydore let his hands fall to his sides in an attitude of limp dismay. Then he sighed heavily. Then he rose slowly to his feet. There was nothing for it but to summon Mumchance, and let the warrant instantly be put into effect. As it was possible, nay, almost certain, that the doctor would be able to clear himself triumphantly in court, the quicker the business was put through, the sooner Master Polydore would recover his right hand. When Mumchance arrived, Master Polydore said, in a voice as casual as he could make it, "Oh, yes, Mumchance, yes, I asked you to come because," and he gave a little laugh, "a warrant has actually arrived. Of course there must be some gross misunderstanding behind it, and there will be no difficulty in getting it cleared up in court. But, as a matter of fact, a warrant has arrived from the lawman of Swan-on-the-Dapple against none other than Dr. Endymion Lear." And again he laughed. "Yes, your worship," said Mumchance, and not only did his face express no surprise, but into the bargain it looked distinctly grim. "Absurd, isn't it?"
said Master Polydore, "and most inconvenient."
Mumchance cleared his throat.
"A murderer's a murderer, your worship," he said. "Me and my wife, we were spending last evening at Mothgreen. My wife's cousin keeps the tavern there, and he was celebrating his silver wedding, if your worship will excuse me mentioning such things. And among the friends he'd asked in was the plaintiff and her aunt, and, well, there be some things that be just too big for any defendant to dodge, but I'll say no more, your worship."
"I should hope not, Mumchance. You have already strangely forgotten yourself." And Master Polydore glared fiercely at the unrepentant Mumchance. All the same, he could not help feeling a little disquieted by the attitude adopted by that worthy. 2 hours later, after a busy morning devoted to professional visits, and perhaps some unprofessional ones too, Endymion Lear sat down to his midday dinner. There was not a happier man in Lud than he. He was the most influential man in the town, deep in the councils of the magistrates, and as for the dreaded Chanticleers, well, he had successively robbed them of their sting. Life being one and indivisible, when one has a sense that it is good, its humblest manifestations are transfigured. And that morning the doctor would have found a meal of baked haws sweet to his palate. How much more so the succulent meal that was actually awaiting him. But it was not fated that Endymion Lear should eat that dinner. There came a loud double knock at the door, and then the voice of Captain Mumchance demanding instantly to be shown in to the doctor. It was in vain that the housekeeper protested, saying that the doctor had given strict orders that he was never to be disturbed at his meals, for the captain roughly brushed her aside with an aphorism worthy of that eminent jurist, the late Master Josiah Chanticleer. "The law, my good lady, is no respecter of a gentleman's stomach, so I'll trouble you to stand out of the way." And he stumped resolutely into the parlour. "Morning, Mumchance," cried the doctor cheerily. "Come to share this excellent-looking pigeon pie?" For a second or two the captain surveyed him rather ghoulishly. It must be remembered that not only had the captain identified himself with the law to such a degree that he looked upon any breach of it as a personal insult, but that also he had been deeply wounded in his professional pride, in that he had not immediately recognized a murderer by his smell. Captain Mumchance was not exactly an imaginative man, but as he stood there contemplating the doctor, he could almost have believed that his features and expression had suffered a subtle and most unbecoming change since he had last seen them. It was as if he was sitting in a ghastly green light, the most disfiguring and sinister of all the effects of light with which the law cunningly plays with appearances, the light that emanates from the word murder. "No, thank you," he said gruffly. "I don't sit down to table with the likes of you." The doctor gave him a very sharp look, and then he raised his eyebrows and said dryly, "It seems to me that recently you have more than once honored my humble board." The captain snorted, and then, in a stentorian and unnatural voice, he shouted, "Endymion Lear, I arrest you in the name of the country of Doramere, and to the end that the dead, the living, and those not yet born, may rest quietly in their graves, their bed, and the womb." "Gammon and spinach!" cried the doctor testily. "What's your little game, Mumchance?" "Is murder game?" said the captain. And at that word the doctor blanched. And then Mumchance added, "You're accused of the murder of the late Farmer Gibberty." The words acted like a spell. It was as if Endymion Lear's previous sly, ironical, bird-like personality slipped from him like a mask, revealing another soul, at once more formidable and more tragic. For a few seconds he stood white and silent, and then he cried out in a terrible voice, "Treachery! Treachery! The silent people have betrayed me! It is ill serving a perfidious master!" The news of the arrest of Endymion Lear on a charge of murder flew like wildfire through Lud. At all the street corners, little groups of tradesmen, prentices, sailors were to be seen engaged in excited conversation, and from one to the other group flitted the deaf-mute harlot, Bawdy Bess, inciting them in her strange, uncontrolled speech. While dogging her footsteps with her dance-like tread went old Mother Tibbs, alternately laughing in crazy glee, and weeping and wringing her hands, and crying out that she had not yet brought back the doctor's last washing, and it was a sad thing that he should go for his last ride in foul linen. "For he'll mount Duke Aubrey's wooden horse. The gentlemen have told me so," she added, with mysterious nods. In the meantime, Luke Hempin had reported to Mumchance what he had learned from the little herdsman about the fish caught by the widow and the doctor. The yeomanry stationed on the border were instantly notified and ordered to drag the dapple near the spot where it bubbled out after its subterranean passage through the Debatable Hills. They did so, and discovered wicker frails of fairy fruit, so cunningly weighted that they were able to float under the surface of the water. This discovery considerably altered Master Polydore's attitude to Endymion Lear. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Neither trees nor men. In view of the disturbance caused among the populace by the arrest of Endymion Lear, the Senate deemed it advisable that his trial, and that of the widow Gibberty, should take precedence of all other legal business. So as soon as the two important witnesses, Peter Pease and Marjorie Beach, reached Lud-in-the-Mist, it was fixed for an early date. Never in all the annals of Dormare had a trial been looked forward to with such eager curiosity. It was to begin at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 7 o'clock the Hall of Justice was already packed, while a seething crowd thronged the courtyard and overflowed into the High Street beyond. On the front seats sat Dame Marigold, Dame Jessamine, Dame Dreamsweet, and the other wives of magistrates. The main body of the hall was occupied by tradesmen and their wives, and other quiet, well-to-do members of the community, and behind them seethed the noisy, impudent, hawking, cat-calling riffraff, prentices, sailors, peddlers, strumpets, showing clearly on what side were their sympathies, by such ribald remarks as, "My old granny's pet cockatoo is terribly fond of cherries. I think we should tell the town yeomanry and have it locked up as a smuggler." Or, "Where's Mumchance? Send for Mumchance and the mayor. 200 years ago an old gaffer ate a gallon of crab soup and died the same night. Arrest Dr. Lear and hang him for it." But as the clock struck 9, and Master Polydore Vigil, in his priestly-looking purple robes of office embroidered in gold with the sun and the moon and the stars, and the other 10 judges clad in scarlet and ermine, filed slowly in and, bowing gravely to the assembly, took their seats on the dais, silence descended on the hall. for the fear of the law was inbred in every Doromerite, even the most disreputable. Nevertheless, there was a low hum of excitement when Mumchance in his green uniform, carrying an axe, and 2 or 3 others of the town yeomanry, marched in with the 2 prisoners, who took their places in the dock. Though Endymion Lear had for long been one of the most familiar figures in Lud, all eyes were turned on him with as eager a curiosity as if he had been some savage from the Amber Desert, the first of his kind to be seen in Doromere. And such curious tricks can the limelight of the law play on reality, that many there thought that they could see his evil, sinister life writ in clear characters on his familiar features. To the less impressionable of the spectators, however, he looked very much as usual, though perhaps a little pale and flabby about the gills, and he swept the hall with his usual impudent appraising glance, as if to say, "Linsey-woolsey, linsey-woolsey, but one must make the best of a poor material. He's going to give the judges a run for their money. If he's got to die, he'll die game," gleefully whispered various of his partisans. As for the widow, her handsome, passionate face was deadly pale and emptied of all expression. This gave her a sort of tragic, sinister beauty, reminiscent of the faces of the funereal statues in the fields of Gramarye. "Not the sort of woman I'd like to meet in a lonely lane at night," was the general comment she aroused. Then the clerk of arraigns called out, "Silence!" And in a solemn voice Master Polydore said, "Endymion Lear and Clementina Gibberty, hold up your hands." They did so. Whereupon Master Polydore read the indictment as follows. "Endymion Lear and Clementina Gibberty, you are accused of having poisoned the late Jeremiah Gibberty, farmer and lawman of the district of Swan-on-the-Dapple, 36 years ago, with a fruit known as the berries of merciful death." Then the plaintiff, a fresh-faced young girl, none other, of course, than our old friend Hazel, knelt at the foot of the dais and was given the great seal to kiss, upon which the clerk of arraigns led her up into a sort of carved pulpit, whence in a voice low but so clear as to penetrate to the furthest corners of the hall, she told, with admirable lucidity, the story of the murder of her grandfather. Next, Mistress Ivy, flustered and timid, told the judges in somewhat rambling fashion what she had already told Master Nathaniel. Then came the testimony of Peter Pease and Marjorie Beach, and finally the document of the late farmer was handed round among the judges. "Endymion Lear," called out Master Polydore, "the law bids you speak or be silent, as your conscience prompts you." And as Endymion Lear rose to make his defence, the silence of the hall seemed to be trebled in intensity. "My lords judges," he began, "I take my stand, not high enough, perhaps, to be out of reach of the gibbet, but well above the heads, I fancy, of everybody here today. And first of all, I would have you bear in mind that my life has been spent in the service of Doromere." Here there was a disturbance at the back of the hall, and shouts of "Down with the senators! Long live the good doctor!" But the would-be rioters were cowed by the thunder of the law, rumbling in the "Silence!" of the clerk of arraigns. "I have healed and preserved your bodies. I have tried to do the same for your souls. First, by writing a book, published anonymously some years ago, in which I tried to show the strange seeds that are sleeping in each of you. But the book hardly aroused the enthusiasm that it so justly deserved, and he gave his old dry chuckle.
In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, the copies were burned by the common hangman, and could you have found the author, you would gladly have burned him too. I can tell you, since writing it, I have gone in fear of my life, and have hardly dared to look a red-haired man in the face, still less a blue cow." And here some of his partisans at the back of the hall laughed uproariously. He paused, and then went on in a graver voice. "Why have I taken all this trouble with you? Why have I spent my erudition and my skill on you thus? To speak truth, I hardly know myself, perhaps because I like playing with fire, perhaps because I am relentlessly compassionate. My friends, you are outcasts, though you do not know it, and you have forfeited your place on earth. For there are two races, trees and man, and for each there is a different dispensation. Trees are silent, motionless, serene. They live and die, but do not know the taste of either life or death. To them a secret has been entrusted, but not revealed. But the other tribe, the passionate, tragic, rootless tree, man, alas! He is a creature whose highest privileges are a curse. In his mouth is ever the bittersweet taste of life and death, unknown to the trees. Without respite he is dragged by the two wild horses, memory and hope, and he is tormented by a secret that he can never tell. For every man worthy of the name is an initiate, but each one into different mysteries. And some walk among their fellows with the pitying, slightly scornful smile of an adept among catechumens, and some are confiding and garrulous and would so willingly communicate their own unique secret, in vain. For though they shout it in the marketplace or whisper it in music and poetry, what they say is never the same as what they know, and they are like ghosts charged with a message of tremendous import, who can only trail their chains and gibber. Such then are the two tribes, citizens of Lud-in-the-Mist. To which do you belong? To neither. For you are not serene, majestic, and silent, nor are you restless, passionate, and tragic. I could not turn you into trees, but I had hoped to turn you into men. I have fed and healed your bodies, and I would fain have done the same for your souls." He paused to mop his brow. Clearly it was more of an effort for him to speak than one would have guessed. Then he went on, and his voice had in it a strange new thrill. "There is a land where the sun and the moon do not shine, where the birds are dreams, the stars are visions, and the immortal flowers spring from the thoughts of death. In that land grow fruit, the juices of which sometimes cause madness, and sometimes manliness, for that fruit is flavored with life and death, and it is the proper nourishment for the souls of man. You have recently discovered that for some years I have helped to smuggle that fruit into Dormare. The farmer Gibberty would have deprived you of it, and so I prescribe for him the berries of merciful death." This admission of guilt caused another disturbance at the back of the hall, and there were shouts of, "Don't you believe him?" "Never say die, doctor," and so on. The yeomanry had to put out various rough-looking men, and Master Ambrose, sitting up on the dais, recognized among them the sailor, Sebastian Thug, whom he and Master Nathaniel had seen in the fields of Gramarye. When silence and order had been restored, Endymion Lear went on. "Yes, I prescribe for him the berries of merciful death. What could it matter to the world whether he reaped the cornfields of Dormare or the fields of gillyflowers beyond the hills? And now, my lords judges, I will forestall your sentence. I have pleaded guilty, and you will send me for a ride on what the common people call Duke Aubrey's wooden horse. And you will think that you are sending me there because I helped to murder the farmer Gibberty. But, my lords judges, you are purblind, and even in spectacles you can only read a big coarse script. It is not you that are punishing me, but others, for a spiritual sin. During these days of my imprisonment I have pondered much on my own life, and I have come to see that I have sinned. But how? I have prided myself on being a good chemist, and in my crucibles I can make the most subtle sauces yield up their secret, whether it be white arsenic, rosalgar, mercury sublimate, or cantharides. But where is the crucible or the chemist that can analyze a spiritual sin? But I have not lived in vain. You will send me to ride on Duke Aubrey's wooden horse, and in time the double-faced doctor will be forgotten. And so will you, my lords judges. But Lud-in-the-Mist will stand, and the country of Dormare, and the dreaded country beyond the hills. And the trees will continue to suck life from the earth and the clouds, and the winds will howl o' nights, and men will dream dreams. And who knows, some day perhaps my fickle, bittersweet master, the lord of life and death, of laughter and tears, will come dancing at the head of his silent battalions to make wild music in Dormare. This, then, my lords judges, is my defense. And he gave a little bow towards the dais. While he had been speaking, the judges had shown increasing symptoms of irritation and impatience. This was not the language of the law. As for the public, it was divided. One part had sat taut with attention, lips slightly parted, eyes dreamy, as if they were listening to music. But the majority, even though many of them were partisans of the doctor, felt that they were being cheated. They had expected that their hero, whether guilty or not, would, in his defense, quite bamboozle the judges by his juggling with the evidence and brilliant casuistry. Instead of which, his speech had been obscure, and they dimly felt indecent. So the girls tittered, and the young men screwed their mouths into those grimaces which are the comment of the vulgar on anything they consider both ridiculous and obscene. "Terribly bad taste, I call it," whispered Dame Dreamsweet to Dame Marigold. The sisters-in-law had agreed to bury the hatchet. "You always said that little man was a low, vulgar fellow." But Dame Marigold's only answer was a little shrug and a tiny sigh. Then came the turn of the widow Gibberty to mount the pulpit and make her defense. Before she began to speak, she fixed in turn the judges, plaintiff, and public with an insolent, scornful stare. Then, in her deep, almost masculine voice, she began, "You've asked me a question to which you know the answer well enough, else I shouldn't be standing here now. Yes, I murdered Gibberty, and a good riddance, too. I was for killing him with the sap of osiers, but the fellow you call Endymion Lear, who was always a squeamish, tender-hearted sort of chap, if there was nothing to lose by it, that's to say, got me the death-berries, and made me give them to him in a jelly, instead of the osiers." It was a pity Master Nathaniel was not there to glory in his own acumen. "And it was not only because they caused a painless death that he preferred the berries. He had never before seen them at their work, and he was always a death-fancier, tasting and smelling and fingering death, like a farmer does samples of grain at market. Though, to give him his due, if it hadn't been for him, that girl over there who has just been standing up to denounce him and me,
and she nodded in the direction of the pale, trembling Hazel. "And her father before her would long ago have gone the way of the farmer. And this I say in the hope that the wench's conscience may keep her awake sometimes in the nights to come, remembering how she dealt with the man who had saved her life. It will be but a small prick, doubtless, but it is the last that I can give her. And now, good people, here's a word of advice to you before I go my last ride, a pillion to my old friend Endymion Lear. Never you make a pet of a dead man, for the dead are dirty curs, and bite the hand that has fed them." And with an evil smile she climbed down from the pulpit, while more than one person in the audience felt faint with horror, and would willingly have left the hall. There was nothing left but for Master Polydore to pronounce the sentence, and though the accused had stolen some of his thunder, nevertheless the solemn, time-honored words did not fail to produce their wonted thrill. "Endymion Lear and Clementina Gibberty, I find you guilty of murder, and I consign your bodies to the birds and your souls to whence they came. And may all here present take example from your fate, correcting their conduct if it needs correction, or if it be impeccable, keeping it so. For every tree can be a gallows, and every man has a neck to hang." The widow received her sentence with complete stolidity, Endymion Lear with a scornful smile. But as it was pronounced, there was a stir and confusion at the back of the hall, and a grotesque, frenzied figure broke loose from the detaining grip of her neighbors, and, struggling up to the dais, flung herself at the feet of Master Polydore. It was Miss Primrose Crabapple. "Your worship! Your worship!" she cried shrilly. "Hang me instead of him, my life for his! Was it not I who gave your daughter's fairy fruit with my eyes open? And I glory in the knowledge that I was made a humble instrument of the same master whom he has served so well. Dear Master Polydore, have mercy on your country, spare your country's benefactor, and if the law must have a victim, let it be me, a foolish, useless woman, whose only merit was that she believed in loveliness, though she had never seen it." Weeping and struggling, her face twisted into a grotesque, tragic mask, they dragged her from the hall, amid the laughter and ironical cheers of the public. That afternoon, Mumchance came to Master Polydore to inform him that a young maidservant from the academy had just been to the guard-room to say that Miss Primrose Crabapple had killed herself. Master Polydore at once hurried off to the scene of the tragedy, and there, in the pleasant old garden where so many generations of crabapple blossoms had romped and giggled and exchanged their naughty little secrets, he found Miss Primrose, hanging stone dead from one of her own apple-trees. "Well, as the old song has it, Mumchance," said Master Polydore, "here hangs a maid who died for love." Master Polydore was noted for his dry humor. A gibbet had been set up in the great court of the Guildhall, and the next day, at dawn, Endymion Lear and the widow Gibberty were hanged by the neck till they died. Rumor said that as the doctor's face was contorted in its last grimace, strange silvery peals of laughter were heard proceeding from the room where long ago Duke Aubrey's jester had killed himself. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The Fair in the Elfin Marches. About 2 hours after he had set out from the farm, Master Nathaniel reached a snug little hollow at the foot of the hills, chosen for their camp by the consignment of the Lud yeomanry stationed by his own orders at the foot of the Debatable Hills. "Halt!" cried the sentry, and then he dropped his musket in amazement. "Well, I'm blessed if it ain't his worship," he cried. Some 6 or 7 of his mates, who were lounging about the camp, some playing cards, some lying on their backs and staring up at the sky, came hurrying up at the sound of the challenge, and, speechless with astonishment, they stared at Master Nathaniel. "I have come to look for my son," he said. "I have been told that, he came this way some 2 or 3 nights ago. If so, you must have seen him." The yeomen shook their heads. "No, your worship, we've seen no little boy. In fact, all the weeks we've been here, we've not seen a living soul. And if there are any folks about, they must be as swift as swallows, and as silent-footed as cats, and as hard to see, well, as the dead themselves. No, your worship, little Master Chanticleer has not passed this way." Master Nathaniel sighed wearily. "I had a feeling that you would not have seen him," he said, adding dreamily more to himself than to them, "Who knows? He may have gone by the Milky Way." And then it struck him that this was probably the last normal encounter he would ever have with ordinary human beings, and he smiled at them wistfully. "Well, well," he said, "you're having a pleasant holiday, I expect. Nothing to do, and plenty to eat and drink, eh? Here's a couple of crowns for you. Send to one of the farms for a pigskin of red wine, and drink my health, and my son's. I'm off on what may prove a very long journey. I suppose this bridle path will be as good a route as any?" They stared at him in amazement. "Please, your worship, if you'll excuse me mentioning it, you must be making a mistake," said the sentry in a shocked voice. "All the bridle paths about here lead to nowhere but the Elfin Marches, and beyond." "It is for beyond that I am bound," answered Master Nathaniel curtly, and digging his spurs into his horse's flanks, he dashed past the horrified yeoman and up one of the bridle paths, as if he would take the Debatable Hills by storm. For a few seconds they stood staring at one another, with scared, astonished eyes. Then the sentry gave a low whistle. "He must be powerful fond of that little chap," he said. "If the little chap really slipped past without our seeing him, that will be the 3rd Chanticleer to cross the hills. First there was the little missy at the academy, then the young chap, then the mare." "Aye, but they didn't do it on an empty stomach. Leastways, we know the crab-apple blossoms didn't, and if the talk in Lud be true, the little chap had had a taste, too, of what he oughtn't," said another. "But it's another story to go when you're in your right mind. Dr. Lear can't have been in the right when he said all them magistrates were played out, for it's the bravest thing has ever been done in Doramere." Master Nathaniel, for how long he could not have said, went riding up and up the bridle path that wound in and out among the foothills, which gradually grew higher and higher. Not a living creature did he meet with, not a goat, not so much as a bird. He began to feel curiously drowsy, as if he were riding in a dream. Suddenly, his consciousness seemed to have gone out of gear, to have missed one of the notches in time or space, for he found himself riding along a high road in the midst of a crowd of peasants in holiday attire. Nor did this surprise him. His passive, uncritical mood was impervious to surprise. And yet, what were these people with whom he had mingled? An ordinary troop of holiday-making peasants? At first sight, so they seemed. There were pretty girls, with sunny hair escaping from under red and blue handkerchiefs, and rustic dandies cross-gartered with gay ribbons, and old women with quiet, nobly lined faces. A village community bound for some fair or merrymaking. But why were their eyes so fixed and strange, and why did they walk in absolute silence? And then, the invisible cicerone of dreams, who is one's other self, whispered in his ear, "These are they whom men call dead." And like everything else said by that cicerone, these words seemed to throw a flood of light on the situation, to make it immediately normal, even prosaic. Then the road took a sudden turn, and before them stretched a sort of heath dotted with the white booths of a fair. "That is the market of souls," whispered the invisible cicerone. Of course," muttered Master Nathaniel, as if all his life he had known of its existence. And indeed he had forgotten all about Ranulph, and thought that to visit this fair had been the one object of his journey. They crossed the heath, and then they paid their gate money to a silent old man. And though Master Nathaniel paid with a coin of a metal and design he had never seen before, it was with no sense of a link missing in the chain of cause and effect that he produced it from his pocket. Outwardly there was nothing different in this fair from those in Doramere. Pewterers, shoemakers, silversmiths were displaying their wares. There were cows and sheep and pigs, and refreshment booths and raree shows. But instead of the cheerful, variegated din that is part of the fun of the everyday fair, over this one there reigned complete silence, for the beasts were as silent as the people. Dead silence and blazing sun. Master Nathaniel started off to investigate the booths. In one of them they were flinging darts at a pasteboard target on which were painted various of the heavenly bodies, with the moon in the center. Anyone whose dart struck the moon was allowed to choose a prize from a heap of glittering miscellaneous objects, golden feathers, shells painted with curious designs, brilliantly colored pots, fans, silver sheep bells. "They're like Hempy's new ornaments," thought Master Nathaniel. In another booth there was a merry-go-round of silver horses and gilded chariots, both sadly tarnished. It was a primitive affair that moved not by machinery, but by the ceaseless trudging of a live pony, a patient, dingy little beast, tied to it with a rope. And the motion generated a thin, cracked music, tunes that had been popular in Lud-in-the-Mist when Master Nathaniel had been a little boy. There was "Oh, you little charmer with your pretty puce bow." There was "Old Daddy Popinjay fell down upon his rump." There was "Why did she cock her pretty blue eye at the lad with the silver buckles?" But except for one solitary little boy, the tarnished horses and chariots whirled round without riders, and the pert tunes sounded so thin and wan as to accentuate rather than destroy the silence and atmosphere of melancholy. In a hopeless, resigned sort of way, the little boy was sobbing. It was as if he felt that he was doomed by some inexorable fate to whirl round for ever and ever with the tarnished horses and chariots, the dingy, patient pony, and the old cracked tunes. "It is not long," said the invisible cicerone, Since that little boy was stolen from the mortals, he still can weep. Master Nathaniel felt a sudden tightening in his throat. Poor little boy, poor little lonely boy. What was it he reminded him of? Something painful and very near his heart. Round and round trudged the pony, round and round with the hidden musical box, grinding out its thin, blurred tunes. Why did she cock her pretty blue eye at the lad with the silver buckles, when the penniless lad, who was handsome and spry, got naught but a rap on his knuckles? These vulgar songs, though faded, were not really old. Nevertheless, to Master Nathaniel, they were the oldest songs in existence, sung by the morning stars when all the world was young, for they were freighted with his childhood and brought the memory, or rather the tang, the scent, of the solemn, innocent world of children, a world sans archness, sans humor, sans vulgarity, where they had sounded as pure and silvery as a shepherd's pipe, where the little charmer with her puce bow and the scheming hussy who had cocked her blue eye had been own sisters to the pretty, fantastic ladies of the nursery rhymes, like them, walking always to the accompaniment of tinkling bells, and living on frangipani and syllabubs of peaches and cream, and whose gestures were stylized and actions preposterous, nonsense actions that needed no explanation. While mothers-in-law, shrewish wives, falling in love, they were just pretty words like brightly colored beads, strung together without meaning. As Master Nathaniel listened, he knew that other people would have heard other tunes, whatever tunes through the milkman's whistle, or the cracked fiddle of a street musician, or the voices of young sparks returning from the tavern at midnight, the morning stars may have happened to sing in their own particular infancy. Oh, you little charmer with your pretty puce bow, I'll tell mamma if you carry on so. Round and round whirled the tarnished horses and chariots with their one pathetic little rider. Round and round trudged the pony, the little, dusty, prosaic pony. Master Nathaniel rubbed his eyes and looked round. He felt as if, after a dive, he were slowly rising to the surface of the water. The fair seemed to be coming alive. The silence had changed into a low murmur. And now it was swelling into the mingled din of chattering voices, lowing cows, grunting pigs, blasts from tin trumpets, hoarse voices of cheap-jacks praising their wares, all the noises, in short, that one connects with an ordinary fair. He sauntered away from the merry-go-round and mingled with the crowd. All the stall-keepers were doing a brisk trade, but above all, the market gardeners, their stalls were simply thronged. But, lo and behold, the fruit that they were selling was of the kind he had seen in the mysterious room of the Guildhall, and concealed inside the case of his grandfather's clock. It was fairy fruit, but the knowledge brought no sense of moral condemnation. Suddenly he realized that his throat was parched with thirst, and that nothing would slake it but one of these translucent globes. The wizened old woman who was selling them cried out to him coaxingly, "3 for a penny, sir, or for you I'll make it 4 for a penny. For the sake of your hazel eyes, lovey, you'll find them as grateful as dew to the flowers. 4 for a penny, pretty master, don't say no." But he had the curious feeling that one sometimes has in dreams, namely, that he himself was inventing what was happening to him, and could make it end as he chose. "Yes," he said to himself, "I am telling myself one of Hempy's old stories,
about a youngest son who has been warned against eating anything offered to him by strangers, so of course I shall not touch it." So with a curt, "No thankee, nothing doing today," he contemptuously turned his back on the old woman and her fruit. But whose was that shrill voice? Probably that of some cheapjack whose patter or whose wares, to judge from the closely packed throng hiding him from view, had some particularly attractive quality. The voice sounded vaguely familiar, and his curiosity aroused, Master Nathaniel joined the crowd of spectators. He could discern nothing but the top of a red head, but the patter was audible. "Now's your chance, gentlemen. Beauty doesn't keep, but rots like apples. Apple shies. 4 points if you hit her on the breast, 6 if you hit her on the mouth, and he who first gets 20 points wins the maid. Don't fight shy of the apple shies. Apples and beauty do not keep. There's a worm in both. Step up, gentlemen." Yes, he had heard that voice before. He began to shoulder his way through the crowd. It proved curiously yielding, and he had no difficulty in reaching the center of attraction, a wooden platform on which gesticulated, grimaced, and pirouetted who but his rascally groom, Will-o'-Wisp, dressed as a harlequin. But Will-o'-Wisp was not the strangest part of the spectacle. Out of the platform grew an apple tree, and tied to it was his own daughter, Prunella, while grouped around her in various attitudes of woe were the other crab-apple blossoms. Suddenly, Master Nathaniel felt convinced that this was not merely a story he was inventing himself, but, as well, it was a dream, a grotesque, illogical synthesis of scraps of reality, to which he could add what elements he chose. "What's happening?" he asked his neighbor. But he knew the answer. Will-o'-Wisp was selling the girls to the highest bidder, to labor in the fields of gillyflowers. "But you have no right to do this!" he cried out in a loud, angry voice. "No right whatever. This is not fairyland, it is only the elfin marches. They cannot be sold until they have crossed over into fairyland. I say they cannot be sold." All round him he heard odd whispers. "It is Chanticleer! Chanticleer the dreamer, who has never tasted fruit!" Then he found himself giving a learned dissertation on the law of property, as observed in the elfin marches. The crowd listened to him in respectful silence. Even Will-o'-Wisp was listening, and the crab-apple blossoms gazed at him with inexpressible gratitude. With what seemed to him a superbly eloquent peroration, he brought his discourse to an end. Prunella stretched out her arms to him, crying, "Father, you have saved us! You and the law!" "You and the law! You and the law!" echoed the other crab-apple blossoms. "Chanticleer and the law! Chanticleer and the law!" shouted the crowd. The fair had vanished. He was in a strange town, and was one of a great crowd of people, all hurrying in the same direction. "They are looking for the bleeding corpse," whispered the invisible cicerone, and the words filled Master Nathaniel with an unspeakable horror. Then the crowd vanished, leaving him alone in a street as silent as the grave. He pressed forward, for he knew that he was looking for something, but what it was he had forgotten. At every street corner he came on a dead man, guarded by a stone beggar, with a face like the herm in the Gibberty's orchard. He was almost choked by the horror of it. The terror became articulate. Supposing one of the corpses should turn out to be that little lonely boy on the merry-go-round. This possibility filled him with an indescribable anguish. Suddenly he remembered about Ranulph.
Ranulph had gone to the country from which there is no return. But he was going to follow him there and fetch him back. Nothing would stop him. He would push, if necessary, through fold after fold of dreams until he reached their heart. He bent down and touched one of the corpses. It was warm, and it moved. As he touched it, he realized that he had incurred the danger of contamination from some mysterious disease. "But it isn't real. It isn't real," he muttered. "I'm inventing it all myself. And so, whatever happens, I shan't mind, because it isn't real." It was growing dark. He knew that he was being followed by one of the stone beggars, who had turned into a 4-footed animal called Portunus. In one sense, the animal was a protection, in another, a menace, and he knew that in summoning him he must be very careful to use the correct ritual formulary. He had reached a square, on one side of which was a huge building with a domed roof. Light streamed from it through a great window of stained glass, on which was depicted a blue warrior fighting with a red dragon. No, it was not a stained glass window, but merely the reflection, on the white walls of the building, from a house in complete darkness in the opposite side of the square, inhabited by creatures made of red lacquer. He knew that they were expecting him to call, because they believed that he was courting one of them. What else could bring him here save all this lovely spawn? Said a voice at his elbow. He looked round. Suddenly the streets were pullulating with strange, semi-human fauna. Tiny green men, the wax figures of his parents from Hempy's chimney-piece, grimacing greybeards with lovely children gambolling round them dressed in beetles' shards. Now they were dancing, some slow, old-fashioned dance, in and out, in and out. Why, they were only figures on a piece of tapestry flapping in the wind. Once more he felt his horse beneath him. But what were these little pattering footsteps behind him? He turned uneasily in his saddle, to discover that it was nothing but a gust of wind rustling a little eddy of dead leaves. The town and its strange fauna had vanished, and once more he was riding up the bridle path, but now it was night. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west. Though it was a relief to have returned to the fresh air of reality, Master Nathaniel was frightened. He realized that he was alone at dead of night in the Elfin marches, and the moon kept playing tricks on him, turning trees and boulders into goblins and wild beasts, cracking her jokes, true humorist that she was, with a solemn, impassive face. But how was this? She was a waxing moon, and almost full, while the night before, or what he supposed was the night before, she had been a half-moon on the wane. Had he left time behind him in Doramere? Then, suddenly, like some winged monster rushing from its lair, there sprang up a mighty wind. The pines creaked and rustled and bent beneath its onslaught. The grasses whistled. The clouds flocked together and covered the face of the moon. Several times he was nearly lifted from his saddle. He drew his cloak closely round him and longed, with an unspeakable longing, for his warm bed in Lud. And it flashed into his mind that what he had so often imagined in that bed, to enhance his sense of well-being, was now actually occurring. He was tired, he was cold, and the wind was finding the fissures in his doublet. Suddenly, as if some hero had slain the monster, the wind died down. The moon sailed clear of the clouds, and the pines straightened themselves, and once more stood at attention, silent and motionless. In spite of this, his horse grew strangely restive, rearing and jibbing, as if something was standing before it in the path that frightened it, and in vain Master Nathaniel tried to quiet and soothe it. Then it shuddered all over and fell heavily to the ground. Fortunately, Master Nathaniel was thrown clear and was not hurt, beyond the inevitable bruises entailed by the fall of a man of his weight. He struggled to his feet and hurried to his horse. It was stone dead. For some time he sat beside it, his last link with Lud and familiar things, as yet too depressed in mind and aching in body to continue his journey on foot. But what were those sudden strains of piercingly sweet music, and from what strange instrument did they proceed? They were too impersonal for a fiddle, too passionate for a flute, and much too sweet for any pipes or timbrels. It must be a human or superhuman voice, for now he was beginning to distinguish the words. There are windfalls of dreams, there's a wolf in the stars, and life is a nymph who will never be thine. With lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire and strawberry wire and columbine. The voice stopped, and Master Nathaniel buried his face in his hands and sobbed as if his heart would break. In this magically sweet music, once more, he had heard the note. It held this time no menace as to things to come, but it aroused in his breast an agonizing tumult of remorse for having allowed something to escape that he would never, never recapture. It was as if he had left his beloved with harsh words and had returned to find her dead. Through his agony, he was conscious of a hand laid on his shoulder. "Why, Chanticleer, old John o' Dreams, what ails you? Has the cock's crow become too bitter-sweet for Chanticleer?" said a voice, half tender and half mocking, in his ear. He turned round and by the light of the moon saw, standing behind him, Duke Aubrey. The Duke smiled. "Well, Chanticleer," he said, "so we meet at last. Your family has been dodging me down the centuries, but some day you were bound to fall into my snares. And though you did not know it, you have been working for some time past as one of my secret agents. How I laughed when you and Ambrose Honeysuckle pledged each other in words taken from my mysteries. And little did you think, when you stood cursing and swearing at the door of my tapestry room, that you had pronounced the most potent charm in Faerie." And he threw back his head and broke into peal upon peal of silvery laughter. Suddenly his laughter stopped, and his eyes, as he looked at Master Nathaniel, became wonderfully compassionate. "Poor Chanticleer,"
"Poor John o' Dreams," he said gently. "I have often wished my honey were not so bitter to the taste. Believe me, Chanticleer, I fain would find an antidote to the bitter herb of life, but none grows this side of the hills, or the other. And yet I have never tasted fairy fruit," said Master Nathaniel in a low, broken voice. "There are many trees in my orchard, and many and various are the fruit they bear, music and dreams and grief and sometimes joy. All your life, Chanticleer, you have eaten fairy fruit, and some day it may be you will hear the note again, but that I cannot promise. And now I will grant you a vision. They are sometimes sweet to the taste." He paused, and then he said, "Do you know why it was that your horse fell down dead? It was because you had reached the brink of fairyland. The winds of Faerie slew him. Come with me, Chanticleer." He took Master Nathaniel's hand and dragged him to his feet, and they scrambled a few yards further up the bridle path and stepped onto a broad plateau. Beneath them lay what, in the uncertain moonlight, looked like a stretch of desolate uplands. Then Duke Aubrey raised his arms high above his head and cried out in a loud voice, "By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west!" At these words, the uplands became bathed in a gentle light and proved to be fair and fertile, the perpetual seat of spring, for there were vivid green patches of young corn, and pillars of pink and white smoke, which were fruit trees in blossom, and pillars of blue blossom, which was the smoke of distant hamlets, and a vast meadow of cornflowers and daisies, which was the great inland sea of Faerie. And everything, ships, spires, houses, was small and bright and delicate, yet real. It was not unlike Doramere, or rather the transfigured Doramere he had once seen from the fields of Gramarye. And as he gazed, he knew that in that land no winds ever howled at night, and that everything within its borders had the serenity and stability of trees, the unchanging peace of pictures. Then, suddenly, it all vanished. Duke Aubrey had vanished too, and he was standing alone on the edge of a black abyss, while wafted on the wind came the echo of light, mocking laughter. Was Fairyland, then, a delusion? Had Ranulf vanished into nothingness? For a second or two, he hesitated, and then he leaped down into the abyss. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. A message comes to Hazel, and the first swallow to Dame Marigold. The information given by Luke Hempin had enabled the authorities in Lud to finally put a stop to the import of fairy fruit. As we have seen, the dapple had been dragged near its source, and wicker frails had been brought up, so cunningly weighted that they could float beneath the surface of the water, and closely packed with what was unmistakably fairy fruit. After that, no further cases of fruit-eating came to Mumchance's notice. But for all that, his anxieties were by no means at an end.
for the execution of Endymion Lear came near to causing a popular rising. An angry mob, armed with cudgels and led by Bawdy Bess, stormed the court of the Guildhall, cut down the body, which had been left hanging on the gibbet as an example to evildoers, and bore it off in triumph. And the longest funeral procession that had been seen for years was shortly following it to the fields of Gramarye. The cautious Mumchance considered it would be imprudent to interfere with the obsequies. "After all, your worship," he said to Master Polydore, "the law has had his blood, and if it will mean a little peace and quiet, she can do without his corpse." The next day many of the prentices and artisans went on strike, and several captains of merchant vessels reported that their crews showed signs of getting out of hand. Master Polydore was terrified out of his wits, and Mumchance was inclined to take a very gloomy view of the situation. "If the town chooses to rise, the yeomanry can do nothing against them," he said dejectedly. "We ain't organized, if your worship will pardon the expression, for trouble. No, we ain't." Then, as if by a miracle, everything quieted down. The strikers, as meek as lambs, returned to their work. The sailors ceased to be turbulent, and Mumchance declared that it was years since the yeomanry had had so little to do. "There's nothing like taking strong measures at once," Master Polydore remarked complacently to Master Ambrose, whom he had taken as his mentor in the place of Endymion Lear. "Once let them feel that there is a strong man at the helm, and you can do anything with them. And, of course, they never felt that with poor old Nat." Master Ambrose's only answer was a grunt and a rather sardonic smile, for Master Ambrose happened to be one of the few people who knew what had really happened. The sudden calm was due neither to a miracle nor to the strong hand of Master Polydore. It had been brought about by two humble agents, Mistress Ivy Peppercorn and Hazel Gibberty. One evening, they had been sitting in the little parlor behind the grocer's shop over the first fire of the season. As plaintiff and principal witness in the unpopular trial, their situation was not without danger. In fact, Mumchance had advised them to move into Lud till the storm had blown over. But to Hazel, Lud was the place where the widow was buried, and full as she was of Western superstitions, she felt that she could not bear to sleep enclosed by the same town walls as the angry corpse. Nor would she return to the farm. Her aunt had told her of Master Nathaniel's half-joking plan to communicate with her, and Hazel insisted that even though he had gone behind the Debatable Hills, it was their clear duty to remain within reach of a message. That evening Mistress Ivy was waxing a little plaintive over her obstinacy. "I sometimes think, Hazel, your wits have been turned, living so long with that bad, bold woman, and I don't wonder, I'm sure, poor child. And if my poor Peppercorn hadn't come along, I don't know what would have happened to me. But there's no sense, I tell you, in waiting on here, with the hams and bacon at home, not cured yet, nor the fish salted for winter, nor your fruit pickled or preserved. You're a farmer on your own now, and you shouldn't forget it. And I wish to goodness you'd get all that silly nonsense out of your head. A message from the mayor, indeed. Though I can't get over its being him that came to see me, and me never knowing, but giving him sauce as if he'd been nothing but a shipmate of my poor Peppercorn's. No, no, poor gentleman, we'll never hear from him. Leastways, not this side of the Debatable Hills." Hazel said nothing, but her obstinate little chin looked even more obstinate than usual. Then, suddenly, she looked up with startled eyes. "Hark, Auntie!" she cried. Didn't you hear someone knocking?" "What a girl you are for fancying things. It's only the wind," said Mistress Ivy querulously. "Why, Auntie, there it is again. No, I'm sure it's someone knocking. I'll just go and see." And she took a candle from the table, but her hand was trembling. The knocking was audible now to Mistress Ivy as well. "You just stay where you are, my girl," she cried shrilly. "It'll be one of those rough chaps from the town, and I won't have you opening the door. No, I won't." But Hazel paid no attention, and though her face was white and her eyes very scared, she marched boldly into the shop and called, "Who's there?" through the door. "By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west," came the answer. "Auntie, Auntie!" she cried shrilly. "It's from the mayor. He has sent a messenger, and you must come." This brought Mistress Ivy hurrying to her side. Though she was not of an heroic character, she came of good sturdy stock, and she was not going to leave her dead brother's child to face the dangers of the unseen alone. But her teeth were chattering with terror. Evidently, the messenger was growing impatient, for he began beating a tattoo on the door and singing in a shrill, sweet voice. "Maids in your smocks, look well to your locks, and beware of the fox when the bellman knocks." Hazel, not without some fumbling, for her hands were still trembling, drew the bolts, lifted the latch, and flung the door wide open. A sudden gust of wind extinguished her candle, so they could not see the face of the messenger. He began speaking in a shrill, expressionless voice, like that of a child repeating a lesson. "I have given the password so you know from whom I come. I am to bid you go at once to Lud-in-the-Mist, and find a sailor, by name Sebastian Thug. He will probably be drinking at the tavern of the Unicorn. Also a deaf-mute commonly known as Bawdy Bess, whom you will probably find in the same place. You will have need of no other introduction than the words, 'By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west.' You are to tell them that there is to be no more rioting, and that they are to keep the people quiet, for the Duke will send his deputy. And next you will go to Master Ambrose Honeysuckle and bid him remember the oath which he and Master Nathaniel pledged each other over Wild Thyme Gin, swearing to ride the wind with a loose rein, and to be hospitable to visions. And tell him that Lud-in-the-Mist must throw wide its gates to receive its destiny. Can you remember this?" "Yes," said Hazel in a low, puzzled voice. "And now, just a trifle to the messenger for his pains." And his voice became gay and challenging. "I am an orchard thief and the citizen of a green world. Buss me, green maid." And before Hazel had time to protest, he gave her a smacking kiss on the lips, and then plunged into the night, leaving the echoes of his "ho-ho-ho" like a silvery trail in his wake. "Well, I never did!" exclaimed Mistress Ivy in amazement, adding with a fat chuckle, "It would seem that it isn't only this side of the hills that saucy young fellows are to be found. But I don't quite know what to make of it, my girl. How are we to know he really comes from the mayor?" "Well, Auntie, we can't know, of course, for certain, though for my part I don't think he was a Doramarite. But he gave the password, so I think we must deliver the messages. There's nothing in them, after all, that could do any harm." "That's true," said Mistress Ivy, "though I'm sure I don't want to go trudging into Lud at this time of night on a fool's errand. But after all, a promise is a promise, and doubly so when it's been given to somebody as good as dead." So they put on their pattens and cloaks, lighted a lantern, and started off to walk into Lud, as briskly as Mistress Ivy's age and weight would allow, so as to get there before the gates were shut. Master Ambrose, as a senator, would give them a pass to let them through on the way back. The Unicorn was a low little tavern down by the wharf, of a not very savoury reputation. And as they peeped in at the foul, noisy little den, Hazel had considerable difficulty in persuading Mistress Ivy to enter. "And to think of the words we have to use, too," the poor woman whispered disconsolately. "They're not at the best of times the sort of words I like to hear on a woman's lips. But in a place like this you can't be too careful of your speech. It's never safe to swear at folks in liquor." But the effect produced by the words was the exact opposite of what she had feared. On first crossing the threshold they had been greeted by hostile glances and coarse jests, which on one of the revellers, recognizing them as two of the protagonists in the trial, threatened to turn into something more serious. Whereupon, to the terror of Mistress Ivy, Hazel had made a trumpet of her hands and shouted, with all the force of her strong young lungs, "Sebastian Thug and Mistress Bess, by the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west." The words must indeed have contained a charm, for they instantly calmed the angry company. A tall young sailor, with very light eyes and a very sunburned face, sprang to his feet, and so did a bold-eyed, painted woman, and they hurried to Hazel's side. The young man said in a respectful voice, "You must excuse our rough and ready ways when we first saw you, missy. We didn't know you were one of us." And then he grinned, showing some very white teeth, and said, "You see, pretty fresh things don't often come our way, and sea dogs are like other dogs, and bark at what they're not used to." Bawdy Bess's eyes had been fixed on his lips, and his last words caused her to scowl and toss her head. But from Hazel they brought forth a little, not unfriendly, smile. Evidently, like her aunt, she was not averse to seafaring men. After all, sailors are apt to have a charm of their own. When on dry land, like ghosts when they walk, there is a tang about them of an alien element. And Sebastian Thug was a thorough sailor. Then, in a low voice, Hazel gave the message, which Thug repeated on his fingers for the benefit of Bawdy Bess. He insisted on conducting them to Master Ambrose's, and said he would wait outside for them and see them home. Master Ambrose made them repeat the words several times, and questioned them closely about the messenger. Then he took 2 or 3 paces up and down the room, muttering to himself, "Delusion! Delusion!" Then he turned suddenly to Hazel and said sharply, "What reason have you to believe, young woman, that this fellow really came from Master Nathaniel?" "None, sir," answered Hazel, "but there was nothing for us to do but to act as if he did." I see. You too ride the wind. That's the expression, isn't it? Well, well, we are living in strange times." And then he sank into a brown study, evidently forgetful of their presence, so they thought it best quietly to steal away. From that evening the rabble of Lud-in-the-Mist ceased to give any trouble. When the yeomen stationed on the border were recalled to Lud and spread the news that they had seen Master Nathaniel riding alone towards the Elfin marches, Dame Marigold was condoled with as a widow, and went into complete retirement, refusing even to see her oldest friends, although they had all come to regret their unjust suspicions of Master Nathaniel, and were, in consequence, filled with contrition, and eager to prove it in services to his wife. Occasionally she made an exception for Master Ambrose, but her real support and stay was old Hempy. Nothing could shake the woman's conviction that all was well with the Chanticleers, and the real anchor is not hope, but faith, even if it be only somebody else's faith. So the gay, snug little room at the top of the house, where Master Nathaniel had played when he was a little boy, became Dame Marigold's only haven, and there she would spend the most of her day. Though Hempy never forgot that she was only a vigil, nevertheless in her own way she was growing fond of her. Indeed, she had almost forgiven her for having spilled her cup of chocolate over her sheets when, after her betrothal, she had come on a visit to Master Nathaniel's parents. Almost, but not quite, for to Hempy, the Chanticleer's linen was sacrosanct. One night, at the beginning of December, when the first snow was lying on the ground, Dame Marigold, who had almost lost the power of sleep, was tossing wakefully in her bed. Her bedroom ran the whole length of the house, so one of its windows looked out on the lane, and suddenly she heard what sounded like low knocking on the front door. She sat up and listened. There it was again. Yes, someone was knocking at the door. She sprang from bed, flung on a cloak, and hurried downstairs, her heart beating violently. With trembling fingers, she drew the bolts and flung wide the door. A small, slight figure was cowering outside. "Prunella!" she gasped. And with a sort of sob, Prunella flung herself into her mother's arms. For some minutes they stood crying and hugging each other, too profoundly moved for questions or explanations. But they were roused by a scolding voice from the stairs. "Dame Marigold, I'm ashamed of you, that I am, not having more sense at your age than to keep her standing there when she must be half frozen, poor child. Come up to your room this minute, Miss Prunella, and no nonsense. I'll have your fire lighted and a warming pan put in your bed." It was Hempy, candle in hand, frowning severely from under the frills of an enormous nightcap. Prunella rushed at her, half laughing, half crying, and flung her arms round her neck. For a few seconds Hempy allowed herself to be hugged, and then, scolding hard all the time, she chivied her up to her room. And when Prunella was finally settled in her warm bed, with an inexorable expression she strode in, carrying a cup of some steaming infusion. It was black-currant tea, for the brewing of which Hempy was famous, and it had always been one of her grievances against Dame Marigold and Prunella that they detested the stuff and refused to drink it even when they had a bad cold, for it had always been loved by all true Chanticleers, from old Master Josiah downwards. "Now, miss, you just drink that down, every drop of it," she said severely. Prunella was too exhausted that night to tell them her adventures. But the next morning she gave a confused account of wanderings at the bottom of the sea, and how they had lost their way in a terrible marine jungle, out of which they had been guided by Master Nathaniel. It was evident that she had no very clear recollection of what had happened to her since her flight from Lud, or rather, since Professor Wisp had given his first dancing lesson. The other crab-apple blossoms returned to their respective homes the same night as Prunella, and each gave a different account of their adventures. Moonlove Honeysuckle said they had danced wildly down the waste places of the sky, and then had been imprisoned in a castle in the moon. Viola Vigil said they had been chased by angry trees into the dapple, where they had got entangled in the weeds and could not extricate themselves, and so on. But on one point all the accounts agreed, namely, that it had been Master Nathaniel Chanticleer who had delivered them. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Master Ambrose keeps his vow. At first, the crabapple blossoms felt as if they had awakened from an evil dream, but they soon found that it was a dream that had profoundly influenced their souls. Though they showed no further desire to run away and roam the hills, they were moody, silent, prone to attacks of violent weeping, and haunted by some nameless fear. Strange, melancholy denizens, in fact, of the comfortable, placid homes of their parents. One would not have imagined that a daughter in this condition would have met with much sympathy from Master Ambrose Honeysuckle. Nevertheless, his tenderness and patience with Moonlove proved boundless. Night after night he sat by her, holding her hand till she fell asleep, and by day he soothed her ravings, and in her quieter moments they would have long, intimate talks together, such as they never had before she ran away. And the result of these talks was that his stiff but fundamentally honest mind was beginning to creak on its hinges. And he would actually listen without protest when Moonlove expressed her conviction that, although fairy fruit had robbed her of her peace of mind, nevertheless nothing but fairy fruit could restore it to her, and that at Miss Primrose Crabapple's she had either been given the wrong kind or not enough. The reign of winter was now established, and Lud-in-the-Mist seemed at last to have settled down into its old, peaceful rut. Master Nathaniel had turned into poor old Nat, and was to most people no more than a lovable ghost of the past. Indeed, Master Polydore was thinking of suggesting to Dame Marigold that 2 empty coffins should be placed in the Chanticleer's chapel, bearing, respectively, the names of Nathaniel and Ranulph. As for the Senate, it was very busy preparing for its annual banquet, which was celebrated every December in the Guildhall, to commemorate the expulsion of the dukes. And it was kept fully occupied by such important questions as how many turkeys should be ordered and from what poulterers, which senator was to have the privilege of providing the wine, and which the marzipan and ginger, and whether they would be justified in expending on goose liver and peacock's hearts the sum left them in the will of a late linen-draper, to be devoted to the general welfare of the inhabitants of Lud-in-the-Mist. But one morning, a polished conceit of Master Polydore's concerning that sweet and pungent root commonly known as ginger, a kindly snake who stings us that we may better enjoy the fragrant juice of the grape, was rudely interrupted by the sudden entry of Mumchance, his eyes almost starting out of his head with terror, with the appalling tidings that an army of fairies had crossed the Debatable Hills, and that crowds of terrified peasants were pouring into Lud. The news produced something like pandemonium in the Senate. Everyone began talking at once, and a dozen different schemes of defense were mooted, each one more senseless than the last. Then Master Ambrose Honeysuckle rose to his feet. He was the man that carried most weight among his colleagues, and all eyes were turned to him expectantly. In a calm, matter-of-fact voice he began thus: "Senators of Doramer, before the entry of the captain of the yeomanry, we were discussing what dessert we should have at our annual feast. It seems unnecessary to start a fresh subject of discussion before the previous one has been settled to our satisfaction. So with your permission, I will return to the sweet and pungent, I think these were his worship's well-chosen words, subject of dessert. For there is one item I should like to add to those that have already been suggested." He paused, and then he said in a loud, challenging voice, "Senators of Doramer, I propose that for the first time since the foundation of our annual feast, we should partake at it of fairy fruit." His colleague stared at him in open-mouthed amazement. Was this some ill-timed jest? But Ambrose was not given to jesting, especially on serious occasions. Then, with a certain rough poetry breaking through the artificial diction of the Senate, he began to speak of the events of the year that was nearly over, and the lessons to be learned from them. And the chief lessons, he said, were those of humility and faith. He ended thus: "One of our proverbs says, 'Remember that the dapple flows into the Dal.' I have sometimes wondered recently whether we have ever really understood the true meaning of that proverb. Our ancestors built the town of Lud-in-the-Mist between these two rivers, and both have brought us their tribute. The tribute of the Dal has been gold, and we have gladly accepted it. But the tribute of the dapple we have ever spurned. The dapple, our placid old friend, in whose waters we learned as lads the gentle art of angling, has silently through the centuries been bringing fairy fruit into Doramer, a fact that to my mind at least proves that fairy fruit is as wholesome and necessary for man as the various other gifts brought for our welfare by our silent friends, the Dal's gift of gold, the earth's gift of corn, the hill's gift of shelter and pasturage, and the tree's gift of grapes and apples and shade. And if all the gifts of life are good, perhaps, too, are all the shapes she chooses to take, and which we cannot alter. The shape she has taken now for Doramer is that of an invasion by our ancient foes. Why should we not make a virtue of necessity, and throw our gates wide to them as friends?" His colleagues at first expressed themselves as horrified, but perhaps they too, though unknown to themselves, had been altered by recent events. At any rate, this was one of the crises when the strongest man inevitably finds himself at the helm, and there could be no doubt that the strongest man in the Senate was Master Ambrose Honeysuckle. When the Senate rose, he addressed the terrified populace from the marketplace, with the result that before nightfall he had quieted the panic-stricken crowds, and had persuaded the citizens, with the exception of such models of old-fashioned respectability as Ebenezer Prim, to accept with calm passivity whatever the future might hold in store. His two most ardent supporters were Sebastian Thug and the disreputable Bawdy Bess. Only a few months ago, what would he have said if someone had told him the day would come when he, Ambrose Honeysuckle, would turn demagogue and, assisted by a rough sailor and a woman of the town, would be exhorting the citizens of Lud-in-the-Mist to throw wide their gates and welcome in the fairies? So instead of repairing its walls and testing its cannon and laying in provision against a siege, Lud-in-the-Mist hoisted its flags and festooned its windows with wreaths of Duke Aubrey's ivy, and flung the west gate wide open, and a throng of silent, expectant people lined the streets and waited. First came the sounds of wild, sweet music, then the tramp of a myriad feet, and then, like hosts of leaves blown on the wind, the invading army came pouring into the town. As he watched, Master Ambrose remembered the transfigured tapestry in the guild hall, and the sense they had had of noisy, gaudy, dominant dreams flooding the streets and scattering reality in their wake. Behind the battalions of mail-clad dead marched 3 gigantic old men, with long white beards reaching below their girdles. Their long, stiff robes were embroidered in gold and jewels with strange emblems, and behind them were led sumpter mules laden with coffers of wrought gold. And the rumor passed through the waiting crowd that these were none other than the balsam-eating priests of the sun and moon. And bringing up the rear on a great white charger was Master Nathaniel Chanticleer, with Ranulph riding by his side. The accounts of what took place immediately after the entry of the Faerie army read more like legends than history. It would seem that the trees broke into leaf, and the masts of all the ships in the bay into blossom. That day and night the cocks crowed without ceasing. That violets and anemones sprang up through the snow in the streets, and that mothers embraced their dead sons, and maids their sweethearts drowned at sea. But one thing seems certain, and that is that the gold-wrought coffers contained the ancient offering of fairy fruit to Doramare. And the coffers were of such miraculous capacity that there was enough and to spare, not only for the dessert of the Senate, but for that of every household in Lud-in-the-Mist. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. The Initiate. You may perhaps have wondered why a man so full of human failings and set in so unheroic a mold as Master Nathaniel Chanticleer should have been cast for so great a role. Yet the highest spiritual destinies are not always reserved for the strongest men, nor for the most virtuous ones. But though he had been chosen as Duke Aubrey's deputy, and initiated into the ancient mysteries, he had not ceased to be, in many ways, the same Master Nathaniel as of old, whimsical, childlike, and, often, unreasonable. Nor, I fear, did he cease to be the prey of melancholy. I doubt whether initiation ever brings happiness. It may be that the final secret revealed is a very bitter one. Or it may be that the final secret had not yet been revealed to Master Nathaniel. And, strange to say, far from being set up by his new honors, he felt oddly ashamed of them. It was almost as if he was, for the first time, running the gauntlet of his friend's eyes, after having been afflicted by some physical disfigurement. When things had returned again to their usual rut, Master Ambrose came to spend a quiet evening with Master Nathaniel. They sat for some time in silence, puffing at their pipes, and then Master Ambrose said, "Tell me what your theory is about Endymion Lear, Nat. He was a double-dyed villain, all right, I suppose?" Master Nathaniel did not answer at once, and then he said thoughtfully, "I suppose so. I read the report of his defense, however, and his words seemed to me to ring true. But I think there was some evil lurking in his soul,
and everything he touched was contaminated by it, even fairy fruit, even Duke Aubrey.
And that spiritual sin he accused himself of, what do you suppose it was?
I think, said Master Nathaniel slowly, he may have mishandled the sacred objects of the mysteries.
What are these sacred objects, Nat?
Master Nathaniel moved uneasily in his chair, and said, with an embarrassed little laugh, Life and death, I suppose. He hated being asked about these sorts of things.
Master Ambrose sat for a few moments pondering, and then he said, It was curious how in all his attacks on you, he defeated his own ends.
Yes, cried Master Nathaniel, with much more animation than he had hitherto shown. That was really very curious. Everything he did produced exactly the opposite effect he had intended it should. He feared the Chanticleers and wanted to be rid of them, so he gets Ranulf off to Fairyland whence nobody had ever before returned, and he manages to get me so discredited that I have to leave Lud, and he thinks me safely out of the way. But, in reality, he was only bringing about his own downfall. I have to leave Lud, and so I go to the farm, and there I find old Gibberty's incriminating document, while the fact of Ranulf's having gone off yonder sends me after him, and that is why, I suppose, I come back as Duke Aubrey's deputy.
And again he gave an embarrassed laugh, and then added dreamily,
It is useless to try and circumvent the Duke.
He who rides the wind needs must go where his steed carries him, quoted Master Ambrose.
Master Nathaniel smiled, and for some minutes they puffed at their pipes in silence. Then Master Nathaniel gave a reminiscent chuckle. Those were queer months that we lived through, Ambrose, he cried. All of us, that's to say those of us who had parts to play, seemed to be living each other's dreams or dreaming each other's lives, whichever way you choose to put it. And the most incongruous things began to rhyme, apples and bleeding corpses and trees and ghosts. Yes, all our dreams got entangled. Lear makes a speech about men and trees, and I find the solution of the situation under a herm, which is half a man and half a tree. And you see the juice of fairy fruit and think that it is the dead bleeding, and so on. Yes, my adventures went on getting more and more like a dream, till the climax. And he paused abruptly. A long silence followed, broken at last by Master Ambrose.
Well, Nat, he said, I think I've had a lesson in humility. I used to have as good an opinion of myself as most men, I think, but now I've learned that I'm a very ordinary sort of fellow, made of very inferior clay to you and my moon-love, all the things that you know at first hand, and I can only take on faith.
Suppose, Ambrose, that what we know at first hand is only this, that there is nothing to know, said Master Nathaniel a little sadly. Then he sank into a brown study, and Master Ambrose, thinking he wanted to be alone, stole quietly from the room. Master Nathaniel sat gazing moodily into the fire, and his pipe went out without his noticing it. Then the door opened softly, and someone stole in and stood behind his chair. It was Dame Marigold. All she said was, "Funny old Nat," but her voice had a husky tenderness. And then she knelt down beside him and took him into her soft, warm arms. And a new hope was borne in upon Master Nathaniel, that some day he would hear the note again, and all would be clear. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LeBoeuf. Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Conclusion. I should like to conclude with a few words as to the fate of the various people who have appeared in these pages. Hazel Gibberty married Sebastian Thug, and an excellent husband he made her. He gave up the sea and settled on his wife's farm. Mistress Ivy Peppercorn came and lived with them, and every summer they had a visit from Master Nathaniel and Ranulph. Bawdy Bess left Lud at the time of Sebastian's marriage. Out of pique, said the malicious. Luke Hempen entered the Lud yeomanry, where he did so well that when Mumchance retired, he was elected captain in his place. Hempy lived to a ripe old age, long enough to tell her stories to Ranulph's children, nor had she any scruples about telling them her views on neighborliness. And when she died, as a tribute to her long and loving service, she was buried in the family chapel of the Chanticleers. Mother Tibbs, after taking a conspicuous part in the wild revels which followed on the arrival of the Faerie army, vanished forever from Dormare. Nor did anyone ever again see Portunus. But from time to time, a wild, red-haired youth would arrive uninvited, and, having turned everything topsy-turvy with his pranks, would rush from the house shouting, "Ho, ho, ho!" By degrees, the crab-apple blossoms recovered their spirits. But they certainly did not grow up into the sort of young ladies their mothers had imagined they would, when they first sent them to Miss Primrose Crabapple's academy. They were never stinted of fairy fruit, for the dapple continued to bring its tribute to Dormare, adding thereby considerably to the wealth of the country. For, thanks to the sound, practical sense of Master Ambrose, a new industry was started, that of candying fairy fruit, and exporting it to all the countries with which they trafficked, in pretty fancy boxes, the painted lids of which showed that art was creeping back to Dormare. As for Ranulph, when he grew up, he wrote the loveliest songs that had been heard since the days of Duke Aubrey, songs that crossed the sea and were sung by lonely fishermen in the far north, and by indigo mothers crooning to their babies by the doors of their huts in the Cinnamon Isles. Dame Marigold continued to smile, and to nibble marzipan with her cronies, but she used sometimes sadly to wonder whether Master Nathaniel had ever really come back from beyond the Debatable Hills. Sometimes, but not always. And Master Nathaniel himself? Whether he ever heard the note again, I cannot say. But in time he went, either to reap the fields of gillyflowers, or to moulder in the fields of gramarye. And below his coffin, in the family chapel, a brass tablet was put up with this epitaph: Nathaniel Chanticleer, President of the Guild of Merchants, 3 times Mayor of Lud-in-the-Mist, to whom was granted no small share of the peace and prosperity he helped to bestow on his town and country. An epitaph not unlike those he used to con so wistfully in his visits to the fields of gramarye. And this is but another proof that the written word is a fairy, as mocking and elusive as Willy-Wisp, speaking lying words to us in a feigned voice, so that all readers of books take warning. And with this final exhortation, this book shall close. Columbine. And can the physician make sick men well? And can the magician a fortune divine? Without lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire, and strawberry wire, and columbine. Within and out, in and out, round as a ball, with hither and thither as straight as a line, with lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire, and strawberry wire, and columbine. Any lass for a duke who wears green, in lands where the sun and the moon do not shine, with lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire, and strawberry wire, and columbine. When Aubrey did live, there lived no poor. The lord and the beggar on roots did dine, with lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire, and strawberry wire, and columbine. There are windfalls of dreams, there's a wolf in the stars, and life is a nymph who will never be thine, with lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire, and strawberry wire, and columbine. End of chapter 31. End of Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees.